Cool. Hello. So with just 2 weeks to go ahead of the new season, we're back recording again, like normal, following a brilliant intermission, which was the summer specials. We really hope you enjoyed those summer specials, which were on behavioral science, fandom, analytics in terms of their interaction with FPL. They were an absolute pleasure to record, but they were done back in June. Like literally the Euros have been and gone since we recorded them. So we've not really done anything, live, as it were, for a whole month now, meaning we're eagerly getting ourselves back in gear from now on ahead of the new season. Basically, it's normal service from here. We are Who Got the Assist. You can find me on Twitter at WGTA_FPL. My Irish friend Anthony here at FPL Stag, also on Instagram, WGTA.FPL. Make sure you give us a follow on those channels if you don't already, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you get it. The other thing, please, if you haven't got around to it yet and you've enjoyed anything we've done over the last 5 years, give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us, as they're greatly appreciated in terms of spreading the word of the pod. The league code is 2IP43T. There's no jingle we can make around that. Just try to remember it and find it. It's on my bio, I think, on Twitter. And we're also on video for the first time solidly now. I did knock together a quick PowerPoint, which you guys can see here if you are watching. But it's meant to be a visual support rather than the star of the show, as it were. We don't have the time or resources as amateur podcasters in full-time employment to put together a proper, edited, spankly take. I'd really love to, but I can't at the moment. So this more rustic look is what we're going to go for. It's always going to be audio first. Head over to our YouTube if you prefer to watch rather than listen to us for whatever reason. But, we are always going to kind of look at it audio first. But if you do watch, you may kind of hear some things which don't make it into the edit, and you can maybe kind of understand a bit better the magic of editing that I tried to put through. Anyway, it's been a month, Anthony, even though to listeners, because they had all the summer specials, it kind of felt like we were with them every week. It's been a month since we've spoken like this. You all right? Did you enjoy the Euros?
Yeah, Tom, I absolutely love the Euros. It's actually incredible how much time feels like it has passed since those Euros at this point. Like it's only a handful of weeks, and yet, honestly, it feels like generations, not to mind years. But those Euros were amazing. They had everything: good goals, great matches, probably the best night of football that I would ever remember anyway, the Croatia, Spain and France, Switzerland night. A night that we were trying to record a podcast.
That was a terrible idea, wasn't it?
Yeah, a podcast which I watched, which I was recording, but I was really in truth just focusing on the France Switzerland game on my phone for the whole entire thing. Yeah,
I think this kind of format of us being on video would not have worked for that, because it was just like, right, hang on, guys, it's a penalty. hang on, don't shoot that now. All right.
Incredible. And look, and in the end, Italy were a great team to watch. They use a really interesting system that relied on so much movement and tactical intelligence. And I thought they were deserving winners of the tournament all in because of that. And so, it was just a good tournament all in all. This podcast, of course, we're bringing us back to FPL, so might as well get to it. We're going to be looking at doing our full pricing analysis. We're going to do this as well as we can in a reasonable length of time. What we're not doing in order to do that is going club by club, running through player by player. More power to those that do that. We've done it in previous years and found it unwieldy. So we're going to try a different tack. So what we're trying to do instead is focus on the key areas that UFPL managers are going to be wrestling with. So how we're going to do that? We're going to look at FPL through the lens of the Twitter template. It's a good proxy for seeing what engaged managers are doing at the moment, and it dodges an awful lot of the fandom and recency bias that tends to drive Game Week 1 ownership overall. That said, please do beware that we have to factor in herd mentality that exists on FPL Twitter. We will do our best to unpick that as we go through, but it is always worth keeping in mind why there are certain players in the template, and maybe if the herd is picking them for another reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick health warning before we go for anything. Things are moving very, very fast at the moment. Only this morning we had to kind of just say, Harry Kane's not showing up to training. And maybe that in itself dates this pod. We recorded on Monday, the 2nd of August in the evening. Please forgive anything we say which may rankle with the truth as you know it. We're hoping that nothing happens tomorrow, which is seismic, to blow everything out of the water. But that is kind of the situation we're in at the moment, and why we left the pricing pod till now. Because at the end of the day, as we said, I think back in June when we initially recorded our kind of first kind of reaction to the season. Well, if we record something back then, it would have all been like, well, we don't know. Oh, maybe this could happen. At least we've got some element of certainty now. Obviously, it's not 100%, but it's a much higher percent of fidelity than it was beforehand. So
even that June podcast, poor Tom had to go back and edit so many times to fix up things to do with like the Daka move and the Sancho move, and it was day by day that pod was being dated. We tried to record it, I think it was 8 days before we were releasing it.
Yeah,
every day there was another issue that Tom had to go and deal with.
It was awful. Lots of times I had to set up in here and try to recreate the sound environment, make it sound like it wasn't, again, magic editing points may not make the actual pod, but I had to recreate the sound environment for how that would sound and slot that into the podcast and hope no one noticed. I know, devious. Anyway, so as Anthony mentioned, the main way we're going to be doing this podcast is to pivot off the current template, correct? As of really recently, on our Twitter. The template is, of course, a portmanteau of Twitter and template. Don't like portmanteaus, you're listening to the wrong podcast, to be honest. And for those who don't know what the template is, that's basically the herd choice, as Anthony kind of mentioned earlier on. If you had to take the most vanilla, bland team that exists out there, that's the template, effectively. And Twitterville, as Anthony also alluded to, can change the template a little bit. Certain differences do exist between the real world, as it were, and the Twitter world, and we'll call them out during this. Anyway, our mate James Correll at FPLJQ, he's coming on the pod actually in game week 3, suggested this team that's in front of you at the moment. I put it on Twitter and people mostly agree with it. I think the only change I actually have made is Antonio has come in for DCL. But basically the team is in goal, you've got Sanchez and Foster. The back 5 is Alexander-Arnold, Dean, Shaw, Fofana and Ayling. Midfield, Salah, Bruno, Rafinha, Buendia, Brownhill, and up front, Watkins, Antonio, and Tony. Obviously, things may have changed again. Like I think I asked people about this 2 days ago, but Ben White may be potentially an entrant now. Brandon Williams at 4.0. He's behind Giannoulis and Max Aarons at Norwich. The only time those two players have been mentioned this whole pod. But he could be another one who could kind of mess up the template. This is the team we'll be using, basically, the one I just described. And as Anthony says, kind of that forms the template to our podcast as well. A sense of beautiful symmetry I actually quite like. And we'll be referring to it from now on just to keep you kind of updated, to make sure everyone's on the same page. Obviously, it could all change tomorrow. And definitely will after the Community Shield next week, when we'll be throwing at everyone to get whoever does goals in that in. But yeah, that's how we're structuring it. We're going to mess the order up a little bit as well. So we're going to do midfielders, goalkeepers, defenders, and strikers. And we're going to look at 3 tiers per position. So premium, support, and fringes. Pretty self-explanatory, I'm sure. The support kind of means, mid-price. Fringes means low price. I'm just trying to save us a couple of syllables, basically. And obvious caveats, whistle stop is an understatement. As Anthony said, there's no way we can be able to cover everyone, and all ownership data is correct at the time of recording. So Anthony, one thing before we kind of jump into it, this year I kind of feel like I'm beginning to see this sort of team, the one we've kind of just mentioned, over and over again, on social media. Do you think that kind of the template has formed quicker than normal this year?
I don't necessarily think it's about that it's formed quicker than normal. I think it's more it has formed further off the start of the season than it has in previous years. And I think so much of that boils down to the fact that the game was released so early in June. It really took us all by surprise when it was released. And so just engaged managers have been tinkering from very early on. Those, there was a few 100,000 people who were signed up to the game within a week or two. That meant that there was, teams that the ownerships were already there. That meant that when new players or the less, engaged managers came in and started making FPL teams in July and into August, they saw who was popular and they started picking them and putting them into their teams. And so I think there was a self-fulfilling prophecy there of that, maybe
the herd mentality got involved, didn't it?
Yes, the herd starts to really push towards this type of team. So I think for a variety of reasons, this team has come together. So yeah, maybe this team has cemented further from game week 1 than previous seasons. That said, as you kind of have already alluded to, Tom, I would expect so many changes between now and the first game of the season on August 13th. When we've got so many preseason friendlies. It's nice to see actually Premier League teams playing against each other instead of touring. I think it helps us with a view to trying to figure out who is going to be in teams. COVID is still causing problems. We've only just today had Dean Henderson has been announced to have COVID. Injuries are going to be inevitable. transfer window is obviously still open. We have the Super Cup coming up with Chelsea featuring in that against Villarreal, and of course Community Shield with both City and Leicester that you mentioned. So between all of those different things, there's going to be so much moving around. But at the same time, there is a template or a twemplate that is very much formed at this point, and it is very early to be able to say that.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe there's a few kind of scrabbles around the edges as well with, what you said about injuries. For example, Lamptey was one of those players who was in a lot of teams and maybe would have gotten a lot of airtime in this podcast. But obviously, since we did the first podcast, Graham Potter's come out and said he's not going to be quite ready for game week 1. So he's swiftly exited the template. Anyway, let's move on. I basically just reflects exactly what Anthony said about the timings there, so I'm not going to go into that.
Even actually, an interesting one is that you could easily be saying that Ben White is going to be in the template at 4.5 now that he has moved to Arsenal. There's an option there that even is going to see a shift in that again. It's a classic example of how this template will evolve as time goes on, but hasn't just yet.
Yeah, no, certainly. Right, let's move on to the very beginning, which is the midfield. So the template midfield is Salah, Bruno, Rafinha, Buendia and Brownhill. That's the kind of 5 there. To start off with the premiums, as you might expect, the template has Mo Salah, who's 49% owned at the moment, around that, and Bruno 41% owned. Quickly, to begin with, Anthony, would you overthink Salah?
I've tried it in previous years and it hasn't worked out. I was probably too loyal because I'd been burnt so many times by trying to overthink the whole Salah thing and sending him out of my teams. And maybe last year I was burnt for being too loyal. But even in a bad year, he was the 3rd top scorer in FPL and he had 22 goals and 6 assists. He was the only player in the second half or in last season who had an XG. He was the only player last season who had an XG of over 20. And only him and Kane had an XG of over 10 in the second half of the season. With an opening fixture against Norwich, and then he has Burnley with his ownership near 50%, with a fair few good fixtures in there as well. I can't build a compelling case not to put him in my side. I think it would be Harry Carey to not put him in.
I think we've gone to that point, haven't we? 4 200 club finishes, 1 Fringe club finish, of course, that first season, where you're kind of like, well, what more has he got to do if you aren't including this guy in your team? Like, he's more than worth the price tag. Of course, last year was his lowest points total ever, I think, in FPL. But as you said, the data speaks for itself. And, I could reel off similar data, but there's no point in really going there. The other one, though, is obviously Bruno. And the question that could be asked and has been asked, and since Sancho has joined, certainly has begun to become debated a little bit on socials, is do we dare step beyond Bruno Fernandes? The usual arguments are out, aren't they? I might not captain him if I own him. And he's got Leeds, Southampton, Wolves, and Newcastle in the first 4. I mean, with Bruno, as I mentioned during Talisman Theory, it's almost become implicit, I think, Anthony, just how good Bruno was last season. I think in the midst of hindsight, we kind of forget that it was his first season in the Premier League. And United haven't had a main man like him for quite a long time.
Yep.
He had the most chances created of any player last season. Joint most big chances created with Kevin De Bruyne. KDB had a lot of injuries, so that's just how bloody good he is, basically. And he had the highest XA. Couple that with him being 5th for XG, and he's pretty compelling. And one thing, though, is that Bruno's non-penalty XG is pretty meh for a premium. So he goes from being 5th for XG with 17.64 to 17th in the non-pen XG ranking, which is just 10. So in terms of non-pen XG last year, he was outscored by the likes of Shea Adams, Timo Werner, and Bobby Firmino in that regard. 10 penalties for him last year, 9 scored. So that means half of his goal outputs was therefore from the spot. But even if you expunge pens for some weird reason, you've still got 9 goals, 14 assists. He's a creator, but a creator with an eye for goal, basically. He's Kevin De Bruyne. Which I think is still decent. And I know there was some penalty mania last year. We mentioned that a lot, but 9 penalties that year. But the last couple of years, United have also been top and second for penalties won. So the year before that, Rashford scored the most penalties with 6. Year before that, Pogba was second with 7 penalties. I think writing them off is a little bit of kind of artificial sort of thinking.
No, I totally agree. United are usually in with near double figures or double figures for penalties, and penalty mania didn't change that. You cited penalties scored. If you just cite, United were missing penalties before Bruno came in, and of course when Rashford was the highest scoring in penalties, it's like Bruno had taken over penalties for half of that season as well, and contributes to them as well. So they're double figures ish for penalties. You can't write them off with United. It's a little bit lazy. I think with Bruno, it is tempting to exclude him from your side, but I think again, a bit like Salah, it would be an overcomplication to do so. And yes, okay, the end of the season was disappointing with him. Fatigue definitely played its part, and United did drift at the end of last season when there was little pressure on them. They only won 2 of their last 6, for example. And even just looking at Bruno's basic stats, his XG and his XA dropped off in the final 10 games of the season. So usually he was getting an XG of 0.42. That dropped off marginally, I suppose, to 0.37. His XA had been 0.3. That dropped off to 0.22. But maybe in points per game, it's where his decline, I guess, was most marked. He'd been getting 6.59 points per game across the whole season, and yet in those final 10 games of the season, it was just, and I don't, it's a bit of, there's an element of quotation marks, just 4.38 points per game. So that's still nearly a return per game is what's that expecting, so it's still saying that he was a decent enough asset, although maybe not worth a premium price. The thing is that Bruno is the type of player who outperforms his stats, and fatigue and just things not being on in the way they should be, just with the head drifting elsewhere, whatever, means that I think those small margins that he tends to make his gains in just weren't being made anymore. And so with that in mind, I think starting off the season, he's had a decent enough rest. The Euros is quite a bit ago for him since Portugal knocked out.
Yeah.
And he didn't even play all that much at that Euros. So I'd be pretty optimistic for him, and I wouldn't overthink it.
Well, certainly. So it sounds like we kind of agree broadly. I've just brought the PowerPoint up to date with the premium kind of template picks. I mean, it sounds like there's not really a question this year about Mane, for example. I mean, serious cold streak last season. And I think that he's probably just one who's kind of a bit of a marginal pick. I mean, we're going to speak about triple Liverpool later on, and he's not one who was really in the equation. It was more about Robertson and Jota. But Bruno, alternatives wise, I think it might be interesting just to meditate for a second. Because you mentioned at the end of last season, obviously, Bruno did slow down. One man did step in then, was Mason Greenwood, who in the exit velocity on my talisman theory piece, which is worth reading if you can find it elsewhere, just go on whogotassist.com, it's right in front of you. He basically kind of took that mantle over the course of the kind of last 10 game weeks. He scored the most points of any United player in terms of attacking points. He's actually had an increasing number of minutes per season between last year and this year. And he's had this change in profile as well, which is really interesting as well. So 2019-20, he scored 10 goals from an XG of about 3. He massively overshot what he had there. And there was that period in Project Restart when he made a mockery of that 4.5 million price tag. Last year, though, it was a different story. So an XG of 7 goals scored. And his XG per 90 rose as did his shots per 90. FPL-wise, though, similar totals, 103 to 106. But maybe because he's becoming a bit more settled in the team, maybe he could be the one to look at, especially with Rashford out. But I guess Sancho's the big one, though, Anthony, that people are kind of thinking, I'm going to give him a go. He could be the new Salah, do not draws. 83 goal involvements, 104 appearances for Borussia Dortmund. Basically, I think he played 83 90-minute games in the time he was actually on the pitch, but it's basically one goal involvement per 90 for Borussia Dortmund over the last 4 years, which is ridiculous if that's translated into the Premier League. And think about the Euros, the likes of Honigstein were dismayed that England weren't playing this guy. So he perhaps, if he does hit the ground running, could be one with that ridiculous goal involvement at Dortmund. If he can translate into playing in red, he could be, an okay sort of solution if you aren't looking at Bruno and you're thinking of moving elsewhere. I mean, as a United fan, you said a minute ago you're not looking elsewhere, but could either of them kind of come to the fore? Or can you understand why either of them could be in a team?
I can definitely understand why people are going for Sanchez. I guess the issue with Greenwood is still that you're just not 100% sure that he's going to get the minutes that you require. You're a bit more sure of it all for sure when Rashford is injured, but at the same time, I feel like Solskjaer has quite a few players to, address in there. We don't know how Sancho is going to take up, attacking space that might otherwise have been Greenwood's. You'd presume Cavani is going to be in there in the mixture as well, and then there's obviously some of the supporting cast players, like Daniel James, who might get a run. And so with that in mind, that's why I'm a little bit off Greenwood. I think it's just too big of a risk. On the other hand, I feel and I can understand why people would go for Sancho. 9.5 is incredibly cheap given his track record coming into the league. And I guess given the team that he's coming into isn't exactly a bad one. If anything, it's one that's kind of on the up year on year for 2-3 seasons. And the thing as well, I guess, is that at 9.5, is he a 200 club player? I think he might be, potentially.
They've got the potential to get there, hasn't he?
Absolutely. And it kind of feels a little bit reminiscent of Son last year when he was so underpriced. And it was like, okay, there's an element of a no-brainer to put him into your side. I still didn't because, I'm not a genius.
Yeah.
But someone like Nick did, just totally identified a 200 club player there, price quite cheap, put him in, easy, get points. And I do feel like there is that with Sancho. I wish actually United were playing in the European Super Cup and had beaten Villarreal, just so that we had a chance to see how United were going to line out with their first team in a competitive game before the start of this season. It's so unfortunate that we don't have that to just get some idea of what they're going to do.
Yeah.
If you aren't going with Bruno, I would say it would have to be Sancho, but you're really taking a massive risk. I'm maybe a little bit too conservative to do that.
I agree. I'm the same. I think it's easier to work downwards than try to work upwards. That's the way I look at it, even though that's a bit silly. You mentioned Son there quickly, worth kind of just squeezing a mention of him in, because in the Talisman Theory, I did mention that he was actually 5th for attacking points last year, and he got really unlucky because of how good Kane was. Obviously, Kane has not showed up to training today, whereas Son has got a new contract. And it remains to be seen what happens here. But I imagine once game week 3 rolls around and they've got Watford at home, loads of people are going to be looking to go into Son. So those people are kind of saying, oh, Kane's a talisman. Son could be an absolute pile of, without Kane. The reality is, though, that, in the past, I remember whenever Kane was injured, Son became a really obvious pickup. And there's really good research done by Chimp Paradox on Twitter, who showed that actually Son's goals per game, XG per game, shots per game, shots on target per game, shots in his box per game, and big chances per game went up without Harry Kane in the team. So there's definitely kind of green shoots of recovery without Kane being around for Son, depending on how Nuno sets him up, of course. But obviously it's one that's clearly firmly in the wait and see mold. But at 10 million, he could be one that is on our short lists. And come game week 3, there's a game which presents itself. Normally you kind of don't make a transfer in game week 2, a lot of people don't. So it could be one of those things that with the 2 free transfers, he could be someone who come in and do that job. One other thing in this area, Kevin De Bruyne, maybe worth just kind of getting rid of City here, actually, Anthony, so don't weigh us down throughout the course of this podcast. Kevin De Bruyne owned by 15% of people. Non-talismanic team last year, but in terms of attack points scored, 5 City players in Gundogan, Foden, Mahrez, KDB, and Sterling, maybe the top 20, and maybe value in defense, of course, Diaz, as we about later. But City last year in FPL was all about timing, getting people like Gundogan onto that defense in terms of goal machine stones. It was about kind of getting them when they were hot. You snooze, you lose. In terms of the midfield and the team as a whole, it was telling that pre-season, before he transferred out to Leeds, Jack Harrison was Man City's highest scoring player in FPL. He'd actually scored 3 more points than Gundogan last season, 160. Safe to say Gundogan 7.5. Yeah, surprised us last season, but he needs Kevin De Bruyne to be out. And Kevin De Bruyne as well. People are saying, well, game week 2, Norwich. I'm sure people are going to go absolutely mad for that. Maybe he could be the Bruno switch. But I think there is one guy who's kind of showing up a little bit, and that's Riyad Mahrez. Lots of love for him at 9. He's obviously been a bit of a kind of per 90 king, maybe getting a new contract at City. He's now 30 as well. So I've got some affinity for him being near his age. He played his most minutes for Man City last season ever, basically. 21 games worth, so nothing. 145 points, less good than last season. And he's a bit of a kind of a Jota-esque per 90 monster, as I said. And it's all about whether he could kind of nail that persistent start. But with Mahrez, what's really interesting is that he's had a full pre-season, unlike the likes of Sterling, Foden, and the Community Shield we've mentioned a couple of times, 4.9% owned. I think that guy could if he does something in that game, Anthony, he could be one of the people who makes a late charge for the Twemplate, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that's really cogent actually with when it comes to Mahrez. I had seen him starting to crop up in a few teams on Twitter, yet not enough for him to knock into this template yet, but he is starting to appear already. So as you say, I think, yeah, he is primed to find his way into this, and there are good reasons to put him in, but it's just timing that makes it just so hard to know what to do with him. You could argue as well that if City don't sign a striker, i.e. Harry Kane, in the lead up to game week 1, is someone like Ferran Torres going to
Ferran
be
Torres.
yeah, this is it. Like, is Ferran Torres going to find his way in, or would it just be Jesus? Like, there's a move away for Jesus being mooted if you listen to Sam Lee in The Athletic, but you'd imagine that's quite contingent on whether Kane goes in the first place. And then, of course, there's Sterling, who we might as well toss into this as well.
Absolutely.
Which Sterling is going to show up in the league this year? He is really well priced, I think, to force a decision at 11.0 in a way that Sadio Mane at 12 is not. He had 3 consecutive 200 club finishes before the 154 points that he got last season. He had a good Euros from a perspective of goal scoring confidence. And I would be really, really interested to see, if he has a good community shield, he's going to rocket into that template as well. And with good reason as well. Like, I really feel like last season was a real aberration for him. And that's a City team that just, produces as a system to feed its players. And for whatever reason last year, it just did not work for him. But I don't think that's going to happen 2 years in a row. He's too good of a talent for them to waste.
Maybe. I'm not sure he'll rocket into the team. Maybe you'll see some people reacting to that, but I still think that, as you said
think
earlier,
of Aubameyang's brace in the Community Shield last year.
But that was because of talisman theory, Anthony. That was not because of Aubameyang's brace. That was because of my amazing writers. No, I'm not that kind of guy. But yeah, no, I take your point. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's move forward in the interest of brevity and move to the support. Which we have given a very, very large kind of price bracket area to 9.0 to 5.5. Maybe we're going to try to kind of cut this up a tiny bit because I guess the template has got 2 players, Rafinha at 23% and Buendia at 12%, one of those players who doesn't quite kind of feature outside of Twitter. So Grealish, 35% ownership, and Mount nearing 21% ownership. Outside the premiums, these kind of options, I call them support options because they're very unlikely to be your captain a lot of the time. You're counting on their sort of, their raw points week to week. But, we should have a look and try to identify our favourite assets around this because, Rafinha and Buendia, there's quite a gap between them and the 2 premiums that we've got here. I just want to kind of bring in one man here, Kai Havertz. So I owned him actually last year, game week 1. And for me, I think the appeal was fairly clear for game 1 this year with Crystal Palace, who were obviously in transition first up. Last year, obviously, didn't set the world alight. 91 points in FPL for a huge £72 million signing. But I think Lampard just basically didn't know how to use him effectively. He was thrown out onto the wing, not really involved. And this is shown in his output. 1 goal and 2 assists before Frank departed in game week 18, I think it was actually. Also COVID. Compare that with Tuchel coming in game week 20 onwards, and it's really fascinating the difference. I mean, admittedly, it's not brilliant, but 0.4 shots on target per game under Frank to 1.3 shots on target per game under Tuchel, 0.5 shots in the box per game under Frank to 2.37 under Tuchel, 1.3 to shots per game to 1.13 XG per game to 0.54 XG per game under Tuchel. And over the last 10 game weeks, his MPXG shot through the roof comparatively, actually. He averaged 0.8 XG per game over the last 10 game weeks. So it just shows that Tuchel knows how to use him. And, some people could say, I'm going to leave him for now. Game week 7, the fixtures are going to turn over. But 8.5 million, he's one of those players who kind of, again, undercuts that. Maybe I'm not saying he's going to be a 200-point player. I think he's still kind of got a little way to go. He's still a young man. But at the same time, you're looking at probably a player who could get 160, 170 points there. And, Chelsea have had a couple of years in the wilderness when it comes to talisman, when it comes to kind of FPL, been looking at the defence a lot. They haven't really had that kind of player going forward you want to be including. We all thought that'd be Werner. And I think Kai could be that guy, the heir to the kind of Hazard talisman mantle. So, I'm, again, quite high on him this year. And he is actually in my team. We'll kind of look at that at the very end of this podcast. But I think he might actually be quite useful as well because he occupies that kind of spot between the premiums and kind of the support that is currently there, it feels like with the 6.5s, you've got a bit of an issue if someone in the middle kind of takes off. And I think Kai kind of nicely does that. I know he's got Arsenal game week 2 and so on and so forth. But equally, I'm not too worried about playing a player from a top team in that kind of game. Anthony, you mentioned that you looked at Grealish as well, and he's one of those players who, he's owned by 35%. Obviously, his fixtures are up in the air, aren't they? His future's up in the air, isn't it?
Yes, this is the thing with Grealish. Grealish at Man City, you can just, add him to the little bit of a discussion we just had and the uncertainty that we were kind of attaching to an awful lot of their midfielders. Him at Villa, I really, really like, and I think he is actually a potential 200 club player there as a talisman at that club. In terms of points per game last season, he had 5.19 points per game. If you multiply that average by 38 for the full season, that's 197. So he was on the cusp of a 200 point season in points per game metrics, at least in the bit that we did see of him last season. So that's pretty impressive in and of itself. He still had 12 assists. That was second for mids and fourth in total. And he missed nearly half the season. And Villa, of course, have good starting fixtures. The problem is, of course, is that he might not get those fixtures. And so what I've also done is I've looked at the two, I think, marquee Villa midfielders when it comes to, let's say goals, because Buendia is more of a provider, how they did last season in that Villa team when Grealish was injured. And those two are Anwar El Ghazi and Bertrand Traore. Now, having looked at that, I currently favour El Ghazi, but I could totally see why you would favour Traore if you kind of have slightly different reasons for picking your players. In that, okay, both players played, so it's 859 minutes that El Ghazi had, and Traore had 1,000 minutes without Grealish last year. So we've got pretty decent data on how they play without Grealish in that Villa team. El Ghazi 0.42 XG per game, which is pretty bloody good for Traore. That's just 0.17. But when you look at stuff like shots in the box and things, Traore, it's 1.67. That's much more than the 0.94 per game that El Ghazi was recording. Traore as well is well ahead in terms of assists and expected assists and attempted assists. So it's, for example, with XA, it's 0.14 per game. El Ghazi, just 0.07. He barely passes, basically. And so with that in mind, I think that Traore kind of has that potential to add a few more goals to his game and suddenly end up as a much better option than El Ghazi. And I think he has the underlying stats there to do that. So that's kind of the reason why I think overall, I think Traore has the higher ceiling there, but I can totally see why you go for El Ghazi to start with, because he is the one at the end of the day who was getting the goals when Grealish wasn't in the team last season. As I say, 0.42 per game. So yeah, there's some pretty good options there in that Villa midfield, all told. And Buendia is obviously the one that is in the template from there, but he's in on the basis of basically what he did for Norwich, which was just create an awful lot of chances that weren't finished.
Don't forget though, he assisted Watkins in preseason. That's probably the compounding bit of evidence which has got him into the template here.
I think back to our summer special, Tom, where the lads were saying that it takes about 20 games for them to start to take into account statistics, and then the template has gone mad on one assist, one preseason game.
Well, he's straight in for me. You're right on Buendia. Fourth for chances created since 1920. He was second behind Kevin De Bruyne for chances created per 90. But he failed to hit 100 points that season. 1 goal, 7 assists. Last season, though, in the Championship, very encouraging, 15 goals and 17 assists. And it was noted, actually, on Who Scored, that Buendia, when he was in the Premier League, he dropped off in terms of key passes per game and shots per game. For Norwich, that is. So maybe he may be better in a better team. And you're right, maybe Villa in general in the midfield could be a good punt for those first 3 games. But is he in my team? I'm not yet sure. I've got a penchant for Buendia from the past when he was at Norwich, but he never seemed to quite be able to replicate it in terms of kind of consistent point scoring. And I just don't know. I do think we've moved from Grealish down to Buendia, and there are a few players who are in the middle. Likes of Mason Mount, and basically the most vanilla player you can probably get. But in terms of those vanilla metrics, like shots for chances created, he's actually top of those for anybody 7.5 million or below. Mads and Barnes, they could come out in the Community Shield. Pepe as well, quick shout for him. Last 10 game weeks of the season, he scored the third most points for mids on 7.5 by some distance, and the most points of any Arsenal player, actually. 57 points, 23 points clear of the person who was second, who was Callum Chambers, Suja's man of Planet FPL. But there's one guy that's worth mentioning here before we kind of get into the 6.5 million kind of maelstrom, Diogo Jota. So I think that he's one, obviously, with Firmino perhaps coming back a little bit late, who is going to be in the mix because he's obviously going to have a full season. Missed has come back a little bit kind of earlier with Portugal being out early of the Euros. A bit of an arc points dodger. But last season, fun fact, he had the highest XG per 90 and shots in the box per 90 of any player in FPL. He had the better ratio of that than Salah, Vardy, Ike, Nacho, etc., etc. But if you stretch that out, you've got an XG of 8-ish, 9 goals scored. Like, with him, you've got a player who's ludicrously effective if he does play, but equally incredibly frustrating as well. And I know we learned on the analytics pod, you mentioned that a second ago, but it's that the players had a big chance, not that he's missed it and frustrated you. But he is certainly a player who I think, similar to Mane, actually needs kind of variance, luck, form, whatever you call it, to go his way. Otherwise, he's likely to be, first subbed, and he's not likely to start the next game. But he could be an example of a player in that sort of 7.5 sort of area. That means that, at the moment with the template, you have kind of this huge drop between Bruno at 12 and a 6.5 in Rafinha and Buendia. So he could be a kind of an example of a player who could occupy a bit of middle ground to allow you to kind of move around this sort of area. But I appreciate why players like Buendia and Rafinha are kind of in the team. I mean, Rafinha, Anthony, is he somebody that you've looked at?
Rafinha is a tempting one, but I think maybe this is me being someone who kind of reacts to herd mentality by trying to push away from it. He's not currently in my side. The thing with him, and of course, his ex-lively is off the charts. To watch him is an absolute joy.
Oh, so much.
Yeah, and last season, he was very good. He there were points in the season where he was more than pulling his weight. He got to double figures for assists with 10. Obviously, got 6 goals as well. And you kind of felt like his early, he obviously wasn't in that Leeds team to start, and the further he grew into the season, the more you felt like he was an important player in that team, and the more you felt that he was an important player in FPL. And so with that in mind, 6.5 could be made a complete mockery of. At the same time, just because Leeds are opening fixtures are just that little bit more awkward, I'm quite happy to go without him to start and kind of maybe put my money elsewhere. The player actually that sticks out to me of that 7.5 possession, and I know that Rafinha is a little bit below that, is Pepe, just because of how he ended last season. I suspect that Arteta can't ignore that. Brentford away, obviously being the opening game of the season. There's an awkward 2 games with Chelsea and City, but then you've got Norwich and Burnley as well. That could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure Adam Pritchard somewhere is celebrating. This
is the thing. But I feel like all of those players, in one way or another, are going to be a punt. With Jota, and we're going to get onto it later, the punt there is that you're not going for another type of Liverpool triple up if you put him into your side. And that's kind of the reason why I'm not too keen on him, because I want to triple up in a different way to one which includes him. And then with Rafinha, it is just those fixtures. I suspect I'm going to probably early wildcard. That's my kind of mental plan at the moment. And I would be very surprised if he doesn't come into my side, because he probably offers better value than Bamford, who of course we'll get onto in the forwards at 8.0.
Yeah. I think Rafinha definitely is that ex-lively factor, which is why he's many a manager's kind of anointed glue guy for the season, which I can get, actually. So 6 goals, 10 assists last season, 133 points. An okay start for the Premier League, as you said. It was a bit stop-start, and he was outscored by Harrison on the opposite flank on 160. Data-wise, though, Rafinha outstrips Harrison on pretty much every measure. XG, XA, per game, shots per game, whatever. And the only real pro in Harrison's column actually is big chances. So Harrison got 90s and on to Rafinha's 5. And Harrison actually appeared in all 38 games for Leeds last season, so 36 starts, 2 subs. And Rafinha actually just 30 and 4 subs. And similar to the exercise I used earlier on with a couple of other players, I worked out Rafinha's points per 90 and extrapolated for 38 games just for fun. So he played 26 games worth of minutes last year for his 133 points, which gives you like 5.1 points per game.
Oh, here we
Multiply that
go.
by 38. You get 193 points. Obviously, that's incredibly crude. That's ridiculous. But it's an indication of what he has in him to do at that price. Perhaps kind of alluding to what you said earlier on, that he can make that 6.5 seem a bit, he can make a mockery of that kind of price tag. And my observation, perhaps, is where Harrison hit his ceiling with the 160, Rafinha certainly didn't. So where Harrison may be slightly underpriced, Rafinha also might be underpriced, but maybe making the comparison between the two of them isn't particularly useful. And the eye test as well, definitely, as we've said a few times, the X Lively will definitely tell you that. Again, same with me. In my team at the moment, no, he's not, because I've got Shaw and Dean, and he plays both of them in the first 2 weeks of the season. So do I want one of my key midfielders playing one of my 5.5 million defenders the first weeks of the season? No, I don't. So he's not there right now. And I agree with you that an early wild card, he could very well find his way in.
Yeah, like Leeds fixtures turn completely. Honestly, they really turn after the United game. I don't know why we're putting Everton in as this like great big fear, to be perfectly honest with you. And I could totally see why you'd want to put him into your side just to ignore the United game, suck up whatever happens in it. And if if he wipes out a clean sheet that a lot of people tend to have, fine. But at the same time, I personally just want to see what Leeds look like starting off this season as well. Yeah. And they were so reliably good against teams that they're better than last year that I'm kind of quite happy to just wait until they play Burnley or until they play Newcastle before that comes around. That's game week 3 and game week 5.
Fair. All right, let's keep it going. So there's lots of players in the 6.5 sort of area. JWP, Lucy Hynett told me he was overpriced, so I'm going to stick with that. Tillemont, too deep lying, I'm going to stick with that as well. Obviously, you've got the North London duo, Adam Pritchard's brother from another mother, Bukayo Saka, and our friend, desperate seeking Dusan's man, Dele Alli, both 6.5 with the potential to push on. Of course, they come at it from different angles. So Dele obviously is now kind of on the downward slope of 3 seasons in the wilderness, but he has 200 club appearance to his name, and he's not been lower than 8.0 price since bursting onto the scene in 2015-16. On the other hand, Saka, the boy wonder, 114 points, 5 goals, 5 assists last season. Could he make his mark? I don't know. Trossard, improvement year-on-year price, points-wise, 79 points, 118 points. There's very little to commend him to us, frankly, looking at the data. He was second for their non-pen XGI, not very far behind Mopay. West Ham is actually fairly interesting, though, just to kind of link it all together. So Jared Bowen is one who's fairly interesting. 141 points, 8 goals and 6 assists. At 6.5, 141 points. It's kind of what you're looking for, actually, season long. He was Antonio's sloppy second last year, but his data is really bland, to say the least. Like, I couldn't find a headline stat for him. So I spoke to our friend Tom Campbell about him, and he said he's a proper and direct player, and that he's obviously the guy who's, when Antonio's injured, he's asked to kind of play in that position. And he played in all 38 of West Ham's games last season as well. So I looked at him when Antonio was injured and not when he was centre forward. So Antonio was out 7 to 9, 11 to 15, 31 to 33. And then Bowen had 11 games deputising. When he was centre forward, he actually had 1 goal and 3 assists. But when he wasn't deputising, it was 7 goals and 3 assists. So he's the case where if Antonio is not in the picture, he's the guy that you don't really want to be looking at, because he's going to be kind of playing the false 9 role, and it's not going to be working for him. On the other hand, though, you've got Souček, who actually did score a decent amount of his points when Antonio wasn't in the team. So the same sort of measure of games that Antonio didn't play in, I looked at for Souček, and he actually scored 4 out of 10 of his goals during that period, and 1 and 2 of his assists. So in less than a third of the season, he scored 45% of his goal involvements. So maybe there could be some element of Souček in there. But the big one for me actually is Ben Rama at 6. Again, not much on data to commend him. A bit of a pump, really, at that price. Being a pretty talented player, FBref puts him in the 90th percentile for assists and dribbles. But he is one who has been coming up in preseason as being a decent sort of punt, the sort of player who could become one of those who does kind of blow up And a note from our friend Blonde knows Maldonado as well. West Ham's attack is one of the few who will have played together all pre-season, um, building that understanding because none of them have been internationals, whereas others have been a bit bitty to returns. A small point, but one worth highlighting. But quite a lot there, isn't there, Anthony?
There's an awful lot there to unpack, and I'm not sure if any of it is actually like worth fully taking out of the box and putting into your side. It's just a little bit difficult. Like Benrahma, for example, I think you've summarized so perfectly as a punt, and I think, to be honest, all of those West Ham midfielders fall into that category for me.
Yeah, they're all but aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, why don't you just spend the extra 0.5, for example, and get Rafinha in then? Because, it's like the stats are just so much better for him, for example. And yeah, like Saka, I felt has just been that little bit overpriced, fall in as a punt now. 6.5 kind of stretches you that little bit more for him. Sure. If he was 5.5 again, I feel like it would be a much harder decision with him. And then, as you say, Tom, there are so many other players in there where it's very hard to kind of commend them on a stats basis, or you have fears when it comes to their minutes, or they've been promoted and you're not quite sure what's going to come with them this season when they, teams just tend to be very unpredictable when they come up.
There's still players like, Trinchal, Brian Hill, players that I could have mentioned that I didn't.
Yes, Sarr as well. There's another one.
Yeah, Sarr. What do you think about him? Anything there? I mean, he's been obviously like talisman theory. I did kind of drop him into the kind of the conclusions. I think it was 106, 107 points last time I was in the Premier League. It's really sad that I remember that. It's not even on my notes, actually. I know people know that I've got those notes for this one, but that's not even on my notes. I think it's about 106 points he got last time. Again, it's always punty, isn't it? Even though he is the talisman.
Yeah, like Sarr was, he was very good in the Premier League when Watford went down 2 seasons ago, and I even had him in my side actually for an awful lot of the period before they went down. And that season, he only had 5 goals and 4 assists, and I think I might have had him for most of the time up until the week before he got that big
season, wasn't it? Where he
he had that big
Liverpool eviscerator.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I sold him the week before that, typically. And
Delafeu and Sarr, God, you must hate Watford.
Yeah, and then last season in the Championship, 13 goals and 4 assists. So he's definitely kind of growing into that side as he kind of grows up himself. But at the same time, again, it's like, is he worth that risk when he's 6.0 and you've got established Premier League players at 6.5, for example, who are going to return, where you can stretch that little bit more to an awful lot of really good options at 7 and 7.5.
Yeah.
No, I just can't see a reason to do it personally.
Yeah, or you could even just buy Harrison or something to get into kind of established sort of mode.
Yeah, and just get your team ticking over and kind of make some decisions with an early wild card from there. I kind of commend that approach an awful lot, to be honest, this season.
Cool. I think the last one I want to mention here, before we move on to the fringe players, I mean, we could mention Mbuemo. I think his name is actually Brentford. He was playing off Tony in a lot of the friendlies, and he was part of the BMW frontline actually. With Brentford. I'm from Brentwood. Brentford, not for long ago. But the one I want to mention actually at 5.5 is Smith Rowe. We're in my boy territory, and you will see that he's in my team at that price. Arsenal's new number 10, new contract, 74 points last season, and obviously it's been asked by a few people quite rightly. This guy's got 2 goals and 5 assists. Why should I be interested in him? Well, he's a young man. The Croydon De Bruyne, and he created more chances and more big chances per 90 than anybody else in the Gunners team last year. And again, Anthony, doing my very crude extrapolation of points, he played 16 games worth of per 90s for those 74 points. So that gives you a points per game or points per 90 of 4.6. So times that with 38, what do you get? You get 175 points. I am not saying Emil Smith-Rowe can get 175 points. I'm guessing he'll get about 130, 140 if everything goes to plan this year. At 5.5, that could be a serious bargain. One data point to leave you with here. I'm not going to push this too far, but I do love ESR. Arsenal won 67% of the games when the Croydon De Bruyne started, and only won 30% when he didn't. And I think that he plays a very specific role in the Arsenal team. The sort of player that we will want to see kind of regenerated for Arsenal, the kind of the Bergkamp best sort of playmaker. Obviously, he's not kind of starting from a forward position, dropping back. He's not kind of starting backward and dropping forward. But he's great to watch. And I'm,
Right.
definitely in my boy territory. Same as
Okay.
same as Josh. But
You put your
yeah,
neck on the
very
block.
fan, very
So
fandom, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, put your neck on the block if you really want to. So they have Arsenal start their season with 2 games against 2 top 6 sides, and then they have 3 games against, arguably
Yeah.
3 bottom 6 sides. How many of those games does Emil Smith Rowe start in?
I think he starts all of them.
All of them.
I don't know why this is a question, because the guy's just signed a huge contract. He's now number 10. Like, obviously there's a big kind of, vote of confidence in him from Arteta. Maybe it's me and, the fandom sort of edge going on, but I don't really see kind of how it could be different, because Özil's gone. I think that he
But
is kind of
Ozil wasn't the
integral
reason
to.
why Ozil wasn't
Yeah,
the reason why Smith Rowe wasn't playing
but
last season.
we need the playmaker, and I think that he has become an integral part from H2 last year, from when he first got into the team. He's got become an integral part to how Arsenal play and how it all kind of fits together. I really do. And I kind of think any questions around will he start feel a little bit kind of I don't know. I'm not really too sure that those are questions that are worth entertaining, just because at the end of the day, if he wasn't the sort of player who's going to start those big games, we'd have sold him to Villa when they offered us 30 million.
But I don't think so though. A 21-year-old player who clearly has a huge ceiling, you're not going to sell for 30 million when you might be able to get 50 million for him in a year, even if he only plays half the games. Like
I think if he was a player who was in that sort of province where he was a sellable asset, then a deal could have been done.
yeah.
We wouldn't have been trying to desperately tie him down to new contracts. I think next year will be really exciting for Arsenal, actually, because we've got no Europe, and you've got lots of Spurs, lots of Leicester, whatever, who did very well without Europe.
Yeah, I suspect no Europe is going to be a huge benefit to Arsenal next year. I feel like, number one, it gets someone like a good coach like Arteta gets a chance on the training ground to really prove his mettle in a way that he just didn't before. But
no
also
midweek
it's
games.
just fatigue.
On,
it's
huge.
just and the fatigue, and not Thursday ones as well.
Yeah,
that they don't have that fatigue problem. I think that the question about minutes is a viable one until we've seen something different. And it's just, towards the end of last season, Arsenal had very little to play for. So sure, he was playing, but of course they were going to give youth a chance. And, he was playing in the Europa League. Okay, great. You couldn't get too confident about it. And then in the weeks before that, we knew he was an important player, but there were injuries that meant that he was getting game time. It's hard to be just fully confident. I really like that you are as confident as you are that he's going to start those games, Tom. That really interests me, just to make sure that your head is firmly on that chopping block, and that would make him very tempting at 5.5, because he is a very good player.
You will see later on that I've got like a little bit of a rotation, so I'm not going to be fielding Smith Rowe. I think
You're not relying on him.
He'll go to first sub during those things, but yeah, no, absolutely right. In the interest of brevity, we should move on. Hopefully that was a useful digression. Fringe players, Anthony, incredibly boring in the midfield kind of area. Josh Brownhill was the one who's kind of gone through recently. There's obviously lots of Billy Gilmore. Bissouma is the one who is owned by the actual template, 15% owned in the actual template. But Brownhill, probably the best candidate, the reincarnation of George Boyd, if anyone owned him back in the day.
Wow. What a shout.
Could not stop scoring, could he, off the bench? I think he got very lucky, because I think there were a few weeks where a few notable players didn't play, like Eden Hazard or whatever, and he happened to have scored a goal. And so there's a lot of kind of existential love for George Boyd. Look it up if you're a bit old, if you're a bit younger.
What a memory. I never thought I'd think of George Boyd again. Thank you.
But the second half of the season, Josh Brownhill, he had the second most shots behind Bissouma of 4.5 million mids, the most shots on target, and the highest XG of all of 4.5 million mids. Yeah, they're not very high numbers. Let's not go into that. And some people might be kind of saying, "Oh, Murphy at Newcastle, he's worth 5."
The reason why Brownhill is in the template is because he scored a brace. He scored a brace in a preseason friendly against some team that I've already forgotten. That's the reason why he is in
He got a
the
decent. He
20.
got a decent amount of minutes last year, and
Yep.
he isn't. He's an okay player. Like I've owned him a Football Manager many a time in the Championship. Of course, I should commend any player to anybody, but that's the reality of it.
Yeah,
And at 4.5, you want a player who's likely to play and has some sort of vague attacking edge, and that's basically what Brownhill has. Maybe
yeah.
Gilmore will see that as well, but I think Brownhill was the most likely kind of guy to do that job for you.
Yeah, so just worth saying, I did a thread on Fringe midfielders the other day, a sponsored thread on Twitter that you can go and dig up if you want. But the key data, I guess, that I pulled out from that was, looking at all of these 4.5 and 5.0 midfield options in terms of, stuff like expected goals and big chances and expected assists and clean sheets, because of course that matters when you're looking at a player like this, and bonus points potential and everything. And really, when you looked at the 4.5s and 5.0 midfielders, Brownhill came up well, but the other player who I think is a little bit of a mystery box at that price tag is no, Alan.
Oh God,
Alan at Everton, 4.5. So the thing with him, okay, is that even last season under Ancelotti, when he obviously his minutes weren't, he didn't play as much as we would have hoped, but on a per game basis, compared to the likes of Yves Bissouma, Declan Rice, Brownhill, and Douglas Luiz at Villa, he would have been better in terms of attempted assists per game. He was better in terms of penalty area actions per game. So he's just generally going in the right direction in terms of going up the pitch. Everything you would expect to improve defensively. So Bissouma is much better from a statistical perspective on an awful lot of the expected metrics to do with predictions and algorithms and things, because basically Brighton's XGC is so good. They just expect him to get that extra point. They expect him to get that extra point for the clean sheet so frequently that he just beats the others just by dint of that. You take that away and he's really not that much better of an option than any of the rest of them. Alan actually stands out. And then if you think that Rafa arriving at Everton, you'd expect him to tighten up defensively, might mean that he'll do a little bit better in terms of picking up those extra points along the way.
3 points per game rather than 2 points per game.
Yes, and he is prone to perhaps finding himself in the box or giving a pass into the box more frequently than most players who cost that much. In the real mystery box, like I called Alan the mystery box, but it's Gilmore is the real mystery box again. At Norwich, 4.5. Will he play? Don't know. Do we have any good stats to commend to you? No, not really. We do, but there are he played 261 minutes in the league last season, so draw your own conclusions from that. He looks good. He plays well. He might start. If he continues to start, then he could be a very good pick. But right now, I would actually commend Alan to you at 4.5 over Brownhill. That's
just to verbalise this as well, Morgan Gibbs-White has played a couple of games in the friendlies at number 10. Anyway, let's move on to the goalkeepers. Get out of midfielder sort of zone, and then talk about the goalkeepers. So the twin plate duo, I guess, is Sanchez and Foster. They're both owned by about a quarter of managers, although the actual template is squarely on Emi Martinez. It's like Nick Pope a couple of seasons ago. 39% of managers own Emi Martinez at the moment. I don't really know where to go with this. And there's lots of ways to look at it. I guess the key question, Anthony, is Sanchez or bust? Have you looked at this?
I have another thread basically that looked at this, and that's kind of the key piece of data that I'm drawing on for an awful lot of my analysis here. So you can go and dig that up if you want. But really, Tom, I think when it comes to Sanchez, you are basically asking yourself, can Brighton turn XGC into can they turn expected clean sheets into clean sheets as much as they did in the second half of last season? Can they do it as much as they did in the second half of last season, when statistically they weren't just one of the best defenses in the Premier League, they were one of the best defenses in Europe in expected stats. And this is the thing, if they can do that, fantastic. Can they do that when White is away? We don't know, for example. Can they do it with, they have decent fixtures, and this means that he finds himself in the template teams as well. I think, to be perfectly honest with you, he's just such an easy pick for game week 1 that I feel like I could totally understand why every manager would just pick Sanchez. Just all of the stats point towards it, all of the fixtures point towards it, the price points towards it. There isn't really a compelling alternative at 4.5. I think there's a strong argument for picking Ilan Meslier the Leeds goalkeeper, purely
that's what I wanted to
because
speak about.
yeah, because Meslier basically, in a way that Sanchez doesn't. Having good XGC and good XCS in Sanchez's case means basically that he doesn't face many shots. He doesn't have to save much. He doesn't rack up BPSs. Meslier, on the other hand, he's kept busy. He's racking up saves all the time. He's getting his points. Almost. Did anyone have any more saves than him last season? I don't think so.
They did. I mean, Martinez did.
Except for Martinez, yeah.
But he had the highest saves per game, actually.
There we go. Yeah, I knew there was one of those stats that he was way out ahead in. And this is the thing, like at 5.0, he could really be good value because that Leeds defense wasn't bad last year. It really wasn't. If it improves even a little bit, it's getting, it's going to be a pretty good return for him. Whereas Martinez at 5.5, it's a little bit harder to make that argument for him. I understand why people might put him in, but at that point, I would say stretch to Mendy and put him into your side for 6.0.
God, now we're getting into proper brain fart
but this,
territory.
Yeah, which is why
I can never spend more than 8.5 on my goalkeeper. Maybe I could just about stretch to Meslier, but I never want to spend any more than that. I think you're right on Sanchez. Obvious pick. I mean, and one thing in his favor I could find, obviously, saves per game was 2 last year, but he only played half the season. One thing in his favour I did find was that his baseline BPS for Brighton in the defence, he's actually second behind Dunk. Meaning if they do have a random, a small margin win, a 1-0 win, I think big man Bakar also noted this. But if they have a 1-0 win, he's likely to get a random bonus if that happens. I think that's obviously very small, because of the pass completion. Adam Webster recently signed a new contract, and he was saying that part of the Potter philosophy, the Potter magic, was that the goalkeeper was an option for passing. So you could give it to Dunkey, or you could give it back to the goalkeeper. So it meant that Sanchez had this sort of, the pass completion.
Jesus, BPS racking up exactly
that BPS sort of options open to him as well because of how Brighton play. A very niche point, but that could also mean that Sanchez, is likely to get you a 7-pointer, where other goalkeepers get you a 6. Very, very small.
Yeah, whereas Meslier could actually get you a 9.
Yeah,
or a 10 or something.
He could be the kind of guy who shows up, away at Man City, keeps clean sheet, and ends up with a 12-pointer. He's that kind of goalkeeper.
Yeah, Sanchez 2.4 saves per game. Meslier 4.1. That's knocking up that 1 point for a save every time with Meslier. That's kind of such a handy thing. Bonus points per game. It's 0.6 bonus points per game for Meslier. It's half that, 0.3 for Sanchez.
I mean, look, we've looked at, we can look at this a lot. And I think that Sanchez is probably the guy.
Yeah,
Meslier is probably the one who wants to play a bit more. We're looking at players, like Guaitar at Palace. People like, oh, he could be interesting. But just look at something like the XGC. Last year, his XGC prevented was minus 12.5. So he let in 12.5 goals. Or 13 goals more than he should have, according to the SGC. It's all a bit yucky. We can't proclaim a new Martinez yet. We're hoping it's Sanchez. Obviously, he was taken off injured, but it was a precaution, apparently. But you know what? Let's just chuck Ederson in, Stag, and enjoy the 50-50 chance of a clean sheet every other game.
Ederson got more points than any Man City defender last year.
He did.
Like Pep Roulette hits so often and so many things happen to their defenders that Ederson ended up outscoring them. Imagine just dodging all of the headaches and just keeping him there, chugging away, getting a clean sheet every other week. But the thing is, and this is why I mentioned Ederson, is that you can say not Ederson. This is why I mentioned Mendy, because the exact same thing can be said for him. Both the City and Chelsea defense in the second half of the season, City for the whole season, were basically getting a clean sheet every other game. They're just perfect, great. 6.0, 6 points every week or every second week. Great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. What a great way to get it,
Do you know who the best goalkeeper was last year though, in terms of XGC?
In terms of XGC per game or
overall throughout the course of the
season? No, Tom. I'll
it was Alisson. Alisson plus 3.9 XGC. That was in the context of Liverpool conceding the most big chances they have in the last 5 years, and the Alisson elite goalkeeper scoring at one end, obviously, but he stopped the most goals compared to the amount of shots he faced the other team. 6.0.
No,
Are you ever going to go there? No, of course
no.
not. So you're looking probably at Sanchez versus Melier, as we've mentioned, and I'm not too kind of upset about that. So I think Sanchez and Foster to bring it back
Mentioned,
to the
yeah,
template makes
mentioned
a lot of
that,
sense.
yeah, and that there's a potential 4.0 option there as well in Foster, isn't there?
Well, maybe
If
that's one of them,
rumors are to
isn't
be
it?
believed, yeah.
That's one of them, isn't it? That could happen. But yeah, I completely understand Sanchez. Right. Shall we take a break there?
Yes.
Because there's obviously been a lot that we've mentioned during this. Probably give people who are listening a chance to kind of pause it, let it all percolate for a little while, and we'll be back in a minute to start on the defense, which again is a lot of detail to go through. All right, let's take a break there. Okay.
Right, so we're back and we're moving on to defenders now. And so I think let's get us back focused onto that template again, because that's what we're using as the crux of this whole entire podcast, looking at the potential FPL options this season. The template defense is as follows: Trent Alexander-Arnold, Lucas Dean, Luke Shaw, Fofana, and Ayling. So what you've got there is, one super premium, two 5.5s, and then two in the 4.5 bracket.
Yeah.
Now, the one that really stands out there, of course, is the 7.5 option, Trent Alexander-Arnold. You may have heard of him. He's 28% owned. And I think a bit like we were saying about Salah and Bruno, there is a question with TAA. Do you dare to go without Trent Alexander-Arnold in your side? And that's the question I'm going to pose to you, Tom.
I think no.
Sorry, a bit Paxman-esque.
Yeah, I know, that's fine. That's fine. It's your interview style, isn't it?
I love it. I love it. Yeah, it's just the way to do it.
Destroy the circus by going for the juggler. I think that, yeah, obviously the template is as it is. I think at the moment for good reason. Obviously, you might see Ben White in there ahead of Fofana or Ayling. Maybe the Brandon Williams as well may come in. But Trent 7.5, 4 or 5 years ago, if we're doing this podcast, we were thinking, that guy is never going to show up. Leighton Baines may be an exception to the rule, but normally it was all about having a bit of a low value defense and putting all the money forward. Nowadays, it's not quite that way, especially this year. And we'll talk about bigger the back in a minute. Trent wise, though, do we dare look past him? No. I think he's got prodigious creative and defensive potential. Last year, 5th most chance created, top 10 for XA. His 8 assists was a bit of a drop off, but it's worth noting that his XA actually moves around a lot season to season. So he's been in the Premier League, as a live asset for 3 years now. In 2019-20, he got 15 assists from an XA of 10 when he was 4th overall. But back in 2018-19, he got 13 assists, so 2 assists less than in 2019-20, and obviously a fair few assists less than the 8 last year. From an XA of just 6. So things really seem to veer around for him. It's more about if his teammates can deliver more than anything else. And worth noting as well that Trent actually scored more points than any other player in FPL last season over the last 10 game weeks. He scored 66 over the last 10 game weeks. So obviously when he gets going, he does get going. And I think I captained him actually 1 week where he did actually score last minute goal, which was brilliant. Liverpool in general, I think, are due after their annus horribilis without VVD. We've added Kognate now to maybe revert to the mean. So last season, their XGC was 52.82, and they were also 8th for big chances conceded. So teams like Newcastle, Burnley, Everton all conceded less big chance than they did. But Liverpool actually only conceded the 4th fewest goals in reality. In 2019-20, their XGC was 41. So last year it was 52, 53 actually, almost. But 2019-20, it was 41, and they only conceded 33 goals. So they conceded 9 more goals last season. But they conceded a lot of big chances. So even with Virgil van Dijk, with the fullbacks playing high, the VVD Gomez axis did mean there were a few big chances created, and anybody who was involved big at the back then will remember the fact that on the counter attack there were there was the opportunity every game where they would concede one or two kind of big chances where, yeah, all your nerves were on end. And in 2018-19, the magnum opus really, just 32 XGC and 23 goals conceded, only 41 big chances conceded. So, I mean, Trent, I think, is one of those players who kind of sits beyond whatever. Like he basically, stats midfield wise, as mentioned earlier as well. You've got a brilliant goalkeeper in Allison there,
Yeah.
who basically has the best SUC stops in the Premier League. But Liverpool in general are really interesting, I think, because there is a legitimate case to double up in the defence. Is Robertson better than Jota? I think is probably one of the things here, because for me, I mentioned look at my team in a little bit. Robertson versus Jota is the big one for me. So last season, Robbo actually outscored Trent. It's actually 2-1 to Robbo in terms of points scored over the last few years. So Robbo scored 213 points in 18-19, 181 19-20, when Trent scored 210. Then last year, Robbo outscored Trent by 1 point, 161 to 260. And comparing the two, they're basically the same player. It's just that Trent's expected profile and per game profile is just a tiny bit better. But actually, more important for me, is this sort of, Liverpool question in general in terms of how we set up our teams, which kind of links us back to this kind of twin player idea. Do we go for a third? I mean, I mentioned Jota's per 90 heroics and the comparisons between him and Robertson's we're looking at for a second. It's not really due to the data. It's more contextual rather than factual. And it comes down to how you set up your team. So for Jota, if you were going to have your third midfielder being Jota, I actually did ask Twitter about this. I asked them, how are you setting up? Are you doing 3 Liverpool with Robbo, 3 Liverpool with Jota, 2 Liverpool only? There are a few people who do have Mane in there, but they're rightly marginalised from society. But the reality is that 51% of 1,119 respondents were going with 2 Liverpool, 34% were going with Robertson, and 15% were going with Jota. There are lights of them, Bancy Castle, who were saying, I can't believe Jota's been overlooked. I can kind of get it though. So Jota, obviously price point wise in the pros column, 7.5 midfielder slot, as I mentioned earlier. He occupies that nice space between kind of Fernandes and the 6.5. His points per 90 brilliance is obviously there. Even if he doesn't play from the beginning, he can do something off the bench. And he's out of position. He's likely to play as a striker. But Jota, if he does play, that's a big bonus because you've got that clean sheet kind of that team sheet shock thing going on. And he's the first man to be subbed normally if he does start as well and doesn't do very well. And he's a bit of a points dodger as well, as I mentioned earlier on. A bit of a poor finish on the cold streak. Whereas Robbo, he's got that consistency of starts. And I don't think Shimikas is going to be threatening him anytime soon. He's got that clean sheet kind of bounce back ability. I think it's going to happen. And there's more routes to points. So he took more corners last year than Trent, for example. On the minus side, though, Robertson, you need to compromise elsewhere, having him, and you'll see that in my team later on. You need a dud forward or a dud mid to kind of make that happen. With Jota, there is this kind of idea that he's a transfer waiting to happen, whereas you don't really have that with Robertson. And the only kind of thing that happens there is that, similar to Jota, you've got disappointment if he gets subbed off. With Robertson, you've got that kind of, losing that last minute clean sheet that really hurts, and it hurts more. You've got Trent and Robertson both doing it, they're both losing it. Like, in theory, I think a Liverpool defense is perfect for our zombie teams if you double up and just set and forget. But in practice, we live our team's performances week to week, so it's quite difficult, I think. I can see why people would, mostly based on the data, kind of be saying, well, if I'm going for Liverpool, I'm going to go with Robertson. But I mean, are you surprised, Anthony, where people kind of saying that would be the way they go?
I struggle to understand it. I think the double up is kind of the way to go for the start of the season anyway. And it just allows you to do a wait and see on
to just hedge your bets, basically. Yeah,
this is it. Yeah, and I'm not even talking about that from an ownership or points against you perspective. I'm really just thinking about it from the perspective of just like how are Liverpool going to be playing? Like Jota and Robbo are about the same price, but when Robbo starts the game, he is on course to get a clean sheet. This is the thing, is that and I expect Liverpool to keep clean sheets more frequently and more dependably than they did last season. Like, it was a clean sheet kind of every 3 games was kind of how it worked out for them last year, give or take a little bit. I expect that to go up to closer to the every other game metric, and that's fantastic. That gives you such a good head start. And whilst Jota is literally, according to XG, 10 times more likely to score, and whilst Robbo is kind of about twice as likely to pick up an assist, those clean sheets make such a difference at that same price point. And it is kind of that transfer waiting to happen thing as well that feeds into this. I think over, yes, there are going to be weeks where not having Jota could burn you, really, really burn you. Yeah. But the thing is that Robbo will just keep chugging away. And I'm trying to be a slightly more disciplined manager this season. And so with that in mind, starting off with that double up and moving away from it, if I really feel the need to, is the way to go. And I think that there is a chance to get, decent results early on by going with that double up. I mean, from an FPL perspective, just because other people are going to be avoiding it because Liverpool had a poor season last year. Like, look, if it turns out that centre back problem hasn't really sorted itself out with the 2 players coming back from injury and things, and maybe that's just, they haven't just immediately started to flower in the way we hoped, fine, grand, early wildcard, fix it. But it's easy to get away, I think, from the Robbo problem. It's much, much harder to kind of improve Jota to, let's say, a 9.0.
Yeah.
With that in mind, and with that in mind, that's why I would be kind of pro that double up at the back.
Well, hold that thought, because for forwards, it means that I think with Robertson, you end up losing a striker in order to keep your team balanced. And maybe that's something that we'll come on to in a little bit. In the premium sort of area, though, you've got the Chelsea and City defenders who are kind of in that kind of space before we get the 5.5s, we'll speak about in just a second. Man City and Chelsea were first and second for XGC last year, and also in terms of the fewest big chances conceded. Chelsea obviously tied up considerably under Tuchel, and City defence, Diaz, set and forget, is obviously out there, and Cancelo as well, the forgotten man a little bit. Don't forget, he was the top-owned defender for a little bit last season. He's had a full pre-season. Could be one worth looking at 6. And also Chilwell at 6 for Chelsea. I think with these players, there will come a time when they are in the meta, they're worth considering, people are going to be buying them in, but they've been squeezed out for now, haven't they, Anthony, by the support players in the 5.5 bracket. And I don't think I've seen a year quite like this, where you've got 2 players who are in the sort of template. Luke Shaw is 47% owned. And I think last season, Anthony, we were a little bit kind of unsure about him, weren't we? I remember doing a pod when we were kind of figuring out why his XA was where it was and why his chance creation was where it was and why his XA was a bit low, but his chance creation was a bit high. What do you make of him? Is it that kind of recency bias sort of element where because he did well in the Euros, people have been buying him in?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of the show thing. I think a huge amount of it actually is recency bias. And the fact that he plays for Manchester United as well. United players just tend to be more popular in FPL is just a thing. And I think those 2 details are combining to really push him up on the agenda. Especially because, I guess on the eye, he looks like a particularly good player as well. When he was playing for England, he looks like the type of player you'd want in FPL. The thing is that, as you say, Tom, last season we found that an awful lot of his chance creation stats were being ballooned by corners, which weren't necessarily doing anything. Yeah. He wasn't getting a huge amount of assists, and his underlying data, when you really dug into it, wasn't actually that good. And whilst you would have pretty big expectations of United's defence this season compared to previous years, obviously now they've got Varane in and all these sort of things, you'd think that that's going to deliver clean sheets that little bit more reliably. I still actually don't understand why Shaw is as nailed into the template as he is. Like, he's one of the most owned players in the whole entire game right now at 47.5% ownership. That seems a little bit excessive to me, especially, like the Leeds game is their first game of the season. That's an awkward game. Like, I would say that's a very awkward game.
It's not nailed on clean sheet, is it?
No. And so kind of with that in mind, like, I actually personally do not have him in my side.
Yeah, I've gone for Diaz instead. You haven't got him in the team.
I don't, but I have Diaz instead. And it's kind of because of that I just don't necessarily understand the hype, as much as it's there to this point. Yeah,
it's a proper FOMO pick, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the data actually in terms of points potential for United, well, Maguire actually had the most headed attempts for any defender last season.
Oh, but it's always those headers that go
Yeah,
back across the box.
They're not good ones.
They're not thumping headers that you want. They're just always that same header that you saw at the Euros over and over again.
Yeah, he's no Gareth McCauley, is he?
If
Let's put it that way.
Kevin Nolan played for Manchester United and he was there to pick up those headers, it'd be like that old thing with Davis. Second ball.
It's not like Maguire. One of my key observations of him, having owned him throughout Project Restart, thinking he'd be a great third player ahead of Martial, is that his attacking instincts are not good. Obviously, he did score a header for England, and we all love that. Great. But the reality is, over the course of the season, and obviously I owned him actually when he was a Leicester defender as well, his attacking headers aren't that good. But I'm much more excited by another 5.5 who's in the template. That's Luca Dean, or Lucas Dean. Luca Digne, I think, as you called him earlier on. It's a bit of a pronunciation issue, actually, Anthony, and that's poor of you.
Yeah, we need to really dig into this one. I'm still not 100% sure.
I think it's Luca Dean, but maybe I've been kind of conditioned by always cheating Dean's list, and who knows. But anyway, so he was actually second for XA amongst defenders last season. He got 9 assists as well, so second for assists amongst defenders, 120 points, which is a bit rubbish actually, the second season in a row. And I think we all maybe are a bit guilty when we look at Luca Dean of remembering or falling prey to availability heuristic. We remember 1819, so as a very kind of retrievable memory, that's what availability heuristic is if you are on our behavioural science podcast, where during that kind of famous run-in where we all sold Everton players because they didn't have a double game week, he went into that kind of period where he couldn't stop scoring. Famously, 1 week he got a brace, the next week he got a red card. But there was a lot of kind of returns for him there. I guess what really interested me with Luca Dean is that Rafa's come in, and I think he could up the ante defensively. Dean is likely, because of reasons, to have the set piece monopoly this year, shared with James maybe, but it looks like James is actually not going to also be at the club by the sounds of it. So he's got a good chance of keeping up that assists ratio that he's got at the moment. But Rafa should mean as well that he's that defensive solidity might accompany that attacking potential that Dean's got. He's going to keep those set pieces, but it might mean that those 5 to 6 pointers turn into 9 to 10 pointers, which is going to be quite big for him. And I also noticed that Dean is second for bonus in Everton's team, and he's further based on BPS. So a clean sheet and assist, if they do 1-2 goals per game, is likely to mean that he's in the mix for bonus, especially if keep clean sheet, marginal gains and all that. One smaller side though. Rafa might curtail him a little bit in terms of getting forwards. The reason I say that is looking at Marcelo's data at Real Madrid during Rafa's season there in 2015-16. There was a huge drop-off in Marcelo's goals and assists per 90 in 2015-16 compared to the other seasons surrounding it. So it means that Dean may be asked to defend more and play more of a, in football manager parlance, a support or a defensive role rather than an attacking one. But, against Millonarios, he did get forward to do stuff. But I think Dean could be given that kind of platform because he's got that defensive solidity alongside having set pieces, alongside being able to kind of provide early crosses into the box. We'll get on to DCL in a bit where I'll expand that a bit more. I think Dean is one that I'm actually quite interested in, especially I don't have DCL at the moment. I think he could be one who I'm happy to kind of cover that with. And I think he could be one who's got a high upside for that price point.
Yeah, actually, funnily enough, you looked at Marcelo. I looked at Rafa Benitez's last consistent left back in the Premier League, which is actually Matt Ritchie at Newcastle.
Oh, God. Converted wing back though, right?
Yeah, converted wing back, but in the same way that Luca Digne is a very attacking player, I would say the same for Matt Ritchie as a left back in the type of left back that they try to play as. And like he
Right.
wasn't too curtailed, you know, again, a bit like Dina, he was
For
benefiting from the use of set pieces and things. But, you know, he tipped away nicely. He got his points, he got his shots in, etc. There was certainly nothing in that data to put you off per se. But like Rafa Benitez is a very pragmatic manager. He uses the tools that are at his disposal. And I think Dina's foot and DCL's head are two, you know, particularly useful tools in that Everton team.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, beyond the 5.5s, I mean, there's lots of ways we could do it. There's obviously Matt. That's where I put obviously FPL Kings thing in the audio. At Spurs, who was top for XG 2 seasons in a row under Nuno back in the day. So 2 or 3 seasons ago, he averaged actually over 10 big chances per season under Nuno as well. But it depends how Nuno sets up under Spurs, because at the end of the day, Nuno did sanction his sale. But the big one, I said to him actually on the first podcast back, I'm going to return to him again, is Vladimir Šufal. So I think he was a 5.0, but he was one who it basically is a 5.25. And I think Josh Moore is cheating, basically said he was 1 goal away from being 5.5. I think that's pretty spot on, to be honest. But last year, he was equal 6th for chances created with Cancelo and 5th for XA amongst defenders. Everyone else around him, though, so Cresswell, we could point at, before he got injured in game week 31, he was nigh on the 200 club, actually, Cresswell. But Šufal, I mean, he's surrounded by players actually at his price point at the points he scored last season. Robertson, Trent, Cresswell, Shaw, Dean. They all had set pieces to some extent to puff up their XA data. Mm-hmm. Whereas, he was 5th for XA. And what's really interesting about him is that he actually created 45 chances last year. 10 of them were big chances. 22%, so more than 1 in 5 of the chances he created were big chances. No defender had a better ratio than that. And in fact, only Kevin De Bruyne and Harry Kane had better big chances to chance creative ratios than him in the Premier League last season. Oh, I'm talking to myself into him again. But I think that's actually pretty amazing. But he didn't really have that kind of data, behind him to push him into kind of, the upper echelons in terms of price points. But at 5.0, like, I feel like if he can replicate that again, Anthony, he could be one who's worth looking at.
Yeah, like completely, that is the case. I think the one thing that needs to be borne in mind if you're putting a West Ham defender into your team, though, and especially with the likes of Cresswell and Šufal, because they're not that dependable from a clean sheet perspective. So you're kind of hoping for getting their attacking returns, which could come against anybody. And so I kind of feel like all of the returns that a West Ham defender might offer you are completely unpredictable. And so unless you're committing yourself to playing them week in, week out, I don't think they're the pick for you. Benching them will definitely lead to heartbreak in a way that you couldn't almost say the same thing for any other team's defenders. I think they're just, these two are particularly kind of well teed up for that. At 5.0 though, he is a really, really, really tempting option. I've really considered him strongly actually. And I'm just kind of averse to West Ham. And I think I kind of start the season like this every year, where I just don't know how that team will gel together. That club is going to, come together for another season. It's like, will they even organize the game and will everyone turn up on the first day? I don't know. Like, will this West Ham team, this was a thing, there was a bit of a narrative last season that West Ham did better because they didn't have a crowd there, getting on the back of David Moyes and a team playing David Moyes football. Will, in the most odd way possible, because this is just not the narrative with any other Premier League team, will West Ham get worse because their fans have returned? I don't know. It could be really interesting to see. And just with kind of all of those details in mind, like I don't want to commit to a West Ham defender because I don't want to commit to playing them every week when I feel there is so much value to be had elsewhere. And as well, they have a few decent attacking players as well.
And you've got Wilson as well, which we'll come on to in just a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
So you don't want to do that to game week 1. Elsewhere in the 5.0s, there's also one guy that's worth mentioning a little bit. which is Lewis Dunk. And obviously he had a toe injury, he's had a long-term sort of, he had a long planned operation not very long ago. Looks like he'll be back for the new season. He'll be back for their next friendly. But last year, actually, he was second for headed attempts behind Maguire. And he had the highest, Anthony, XG for a defender, 4.15. He was second in for shots in the box to Harry Maguire. But he actually is the main set piece target for West Brom. And he said he has the odd shot from set pieces himself. But he was third for SG last season as well. So he's one of those players who people are looking at and thinking, oh, West. I think Brighton don't play a top 4 team, top 8 in the first 8 game weeks. So people are kind of thinking, oh, should I pay an extra 0.5 for this guy?
Interesting, actually, just the vagaries that come with XG data. The XG data that I'm looking at, he's only listed as 5th in terms of XG, 2.1, which just kind of shows you how kind of they're still subjective. These things are. Go listen to our one of our summer specials to see more of that.
I've got hub data here, I think.
Fix, yeah. I'm using Fix, so it's Opta.
Yeah, yes.
But it just shows you the vagaries of these things. Yeah, I think Dunk is obviously a good option. I think the problem with Dunk is that unless you want to double up on the Brighton defense. And like at that point, I think alarm bells need to be ringing in your head if you're talking about doubling up on the Brighton defense, I think ahead of the start of the season, especially if you're going to do that by spending 4.5 on Sanchez and another 5 on Dunk. I think it's just too much to ask. There are so many good options there at 5.0 and even 5.5 if you make that stretch. To put Dunk in to get Brighton clean sheets seems like a little bit of a waste when there are perfectly good 4.5 defender options there from Brighton.
Absolutely. I think the other 5.0 is to cover off. Obviously, you got lots of Tesco Bag, Tierney, Semedo, Soyuncu and co. One that could be thrown into the mix is covering the Martinez potential big ouchie, given the ownership of Martinez.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at this very briefly. I couldn't find anything to basically recommend any of the Villa defence. Cash, Conser, nowhere. Target 9th for chances created. Mings had 15 head attempts last season. Targets at the occasional corner. I mean, you're really kind of clutching at straws, and those for me feel like the ultimate kind of FOMO pick kind of situation, and I don't like them at all. So I think we'll leave it there and we'll move on to the fringes, which is obviously looking at Fofana and Ayling. Fofana, boring pick, whatever, mare player, sit and play. Basically, the only data he's got is he could keep a clean sheet. And Johnny Evans has got necrotizing fasciitis on his feet, whatever it is. I think it's plantar fasciitis on his heels, which means that he can, sometimes he's not going to be playing. Ayling, I think could be really interesting. So as our friends Seb Wassel always points out, Ayling actually had the highest XGI versus actual goal involvement gap of any player last season. So his XGI was 4.9 higher than his actual returns. So five goals or assists that should have been there. He didn't get. So no returns there. I can see why he's also in the meta, as it were. And surely that's not going to happen again. 4.5, so Anthony, is there anybody you're favouring here? Because it's quite a vexed question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult question. I can see why Ayling kind of stands out just from those kind of chances created perspective. You could kind of point at the likes of Loughton as well in that kind of cheap accessible category.
Oh yeah, no, he's on the list there.
yeah. But to be honest with you, I think now that Ben White has moved to Arsenal, he has kind of superseded all the rest of them. Just because Arsenal's defense is actually quite good and has improved, markedly. In recent times, towards the end of last season, it was actually starting to become a defense that you could buy into. And now having a 4.5 option in there, I think makes that a pretty easy choice. The thing with, I think Fofana is such a tempting option, but number one, you've got the plantar fasciitis, as you say, with Evans. That means that Fofana will get his game time, but there are, Fofana has competition for centre back berths if they're playing two centre backs, and Leicester's defense hasn't actually been that good anyway. And so with that in mind, I don't understand really the kind of the push for him. I think people have just kind of gone with, oh, Leicester, they finished high last year. Oh, Fofana, 4.5, great.
Yeah.
And kind of put him into the side. And I don't think there's much more to that. Ailing, as I say, the chance to create it makes it tempting. I do wonder, and I'd love if someone could look at the data. Is it just because the fact that Ailing is crossing from a side that ends up landing balls on Bamford's weaker foot means that he doesn't end up getting as many assists as he might?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can see. Yeah, it's the sort of thing like it's a very kind of like FIFA diagnostic, but it's entirely possible. But either it would be unusual to say the least if that was the case. But either way, it's just those early difficult fixtures for Leeds, a bit like we were talking about Rafinha earlier, means that he doesn't find his way into my initial squad. But I think that Leeds defence, and we were talking about Medier earlier, will offer pretty good value at times. And Ailing is, the cheap route into it that might produce something for you attack-wise too.
I just think overall, these are a set of players who are proper fringe. They're the kind of player who is going to be first sub, second sub. It's not like the days of old where this kind of player would be your 11th man. I think they're kind of firmly on your bench. I mean, I've got Veltman at the moment, basically, because if you look at his data, he had the first best XA of the 4.5s left in the Premier League after last season, and he obviously is quite versatile. So he could play in the centre back role, he could play in the right wing back role if Lamptey's not around. But Ben White, I think, is probably going to be, as you said, the one who, logically, if you were going to be making a zombie team, would be the one who'd be thrown in. Just because at the end of the day, I think you'd be expecting him to get 130, 140 points. Perfect. That's what we're looking at. Ailing could do that as well.
Yeah, and then just in the to watch, but fixtures means that they're not initially in our plans. The likes of Cody, I would say, is in that. Joachim Andersen at Palace, just because he was such a menace at corners for Fulham. I could see a team that's in transition just trying to pick up a few goals off corners, taking the easy option with him. So he could be a pretty interesting option for Palace when their fixtures turn, but their fixtures are just diabolical for ages. And then there's the Burnley too of Loughton and Taylor, but not now.
I think Loughton actually was the most creative of this lot. But yeah, you're really scraping the barrel, aren't you?
Yeah.
And 4.0, sure. Let's not even go there. I mean, you've got Omid Bamidele at Norwich. You've got Brandon Williams at Norwich.
Potential Brandon Williams, yeah.
Manquillo. I mean, there's no Wan-Bissaka. There's no Lindstram this season, as far as I know. So it sounds like we're kind of broadly kind of questioning the 4.5s there in the template. We kind of know why they're there. It kind of makes sense that they're in the template. So there it kind of goes. I think let's move on to the forwards. The three who are in the forwards kind of option are Watkins, Antonio. Antonio was a bit contentious. People were saying DCL should probably be there. Other people were saying, I originally put DCL in there, actually. People were saying, Antonio, actually, he's the one who's now come through. And Tony, although his ownership actually has declined, I think it's around kind of 40% mark, and now it's around the kind of the third mark. So it's kind of happening. But one of the things that obviously is noticeable is that the premium strikers are left out of the swim plate at this point. Is that because of big at the back? Is that because of the fact that in midfield you're looking at Bruno and looking at Salah? Probably yes, and also because there's an uncertainty about Kane. So we all know, and recently today being Monday, the 2nd of August. Obviously, if things change after this, I'm really sorry, but I didn't know that. There's obviously a difference in kind of Kane versus the world. In the world, outside of Twitter, 29% of people own Kane in their teams. So there's huge ownership. And that's obviously due to him being the Tasman King last year. They all read Tasman Theory, as far as I'm concerned. It's worth restating the findings of that one more time. Obviously, last year he was the Golden Boot, Golden Sister, whatever it's called. And it was his best Premier League season ever in terms of FPL as well. And it was a huge turnaround for Kane. We've all kind of brushed past it due to hindsight bias, I think a bit. Hindsight bias is creeping determinism, the I knew all along effect. But last season we looked at him really skeptically. Like we were laughing at people who had him in game week 1, game week 2. And I looked at last years notes for this, Anthony, when we were doing this, and I noticed in that his exit velocity from last season was something to behold, but there was nothing else apart from that because I kind of was too busy focusing on Anthony Martial
Oh dear.
because after his ridiculous project restart, I wanted to fit him into my team and get him in as my kind of sub one. Um, but Kane's still a player who comes with a guarantee wherever he is of scoring 15 goals per season. It's just the contextual uncertainty about him which is throwing people off. If he goes to City, it's probably where it's interesting at this point. I think he becomes pretty damn sexy, actually. He's not mobile, really, but I like to think about how Pep changed Kun Aguero. So Aguero used to be a poacher or an advanced forward football manager parlance before Pep got his hand on him. Now, don't forget, Jesus came in and there was lots of chat. Remember the infamous Jamie Jackson moment ahead of Huddersfield in game week 2, 2018-19?
Oh my word, I'd forgotten.
Yeah, which I think still means that Jamie Jackson hates FPL altogether. But anyway, there was a kind of friction allegedly between Pep and Aguero. But I think Kane does what Pep wants Aguero to do. Leads the line, gets involved in the play, he's love a striker with the ball, great corner according to Roy Hodgson as well. But I feel like in some ways he's the ideal kind of integrative striker that Pep is looking to spearhead a team of his. A creative player who is lethal as well when offered a chance. But at the time of recording, he's not showing up to training. So I think he could be left out of the mix. And I think, Anthony, the likes of him, Vardy, Aubameyang, Werner, Firmino, basically everybody down to Dominic Calvert-Lewin at 8, they've all got problems with them, haven't they?
Yes, pretty much. Like it's an easy answer, short answer. Yes, there is. I was quite disappointed, and I know it wouldn't have made much sense from a consistency perspective, but I was quite disappointed when Sancho was put in as a midfielder. I feel like if he was put in as a forward, it would have just set the cat amongst the pigeons in an unbelievable way in FPL this year. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. He would have just really disrupted the price structure. Instead, though, it's the risk, I think, more than anything that means that none of these other options are interesting. So like someone like Vardy, I think you could build a case for, you would say that he's, he is aging and he's changing his profile. And so now you're depending on penalties and assists and, getting the odd goal and all this sort of thing. You could point to some of the Arsenal players, Aubameyang pretty much, and say, I think that Arsenal are going to turn the corner. But it's hard to. Bamford is the one you could point to and say 8.0. It's just that it's high, but it kind of brings him into that just above all of the 7.5 and 7 options that we have. And I think that actually makes him a premium just because he's not one of them. And even for him, I think you can start to kind of construct arguments against him based on fixtures and things, but also based perhaps on all the tropes that used to be associated with him before he surprised everyone last year with a really, really good season.
Yeah.
That is why we've just ended up kind of all falling into this kind of 7.5 and 7 to maybe 6.5 trap, isn't it?
Yeah, basically. I mean, the template is Watkins, Antonio, Tony. Watkins owned by 35%, Tony by 32%, and DCL was on 27%. But I'm told reliably by loads of people on Twitter that Antonio is now in the mix, 30% owned. There's also, the likes of Bamford, 18% owned, and Nacho, 14% owned. Basically, we've got a mid-priced forwards glut in this kind of support area. Are we realistically, basically, Anthony, fishing in the same pool of players? Are we looking at basically kind of making 2 or 3 from 4 or 5? Watkins, Tony, DCL, Antonio, and maybe Bamford seem to be the ones for me.
Callum Wilson, I would throw into that as well.
That's what I'd throw into.
You've got I think it is. And I think you can, again, it's a bit like this. You can construct arguments in favor of all of them. So, you look at the likes of Watkins and you can point to obviously his returns last season. You can point to the fact that he was able to do it and Grealish wasn't in the team. His stats were good. His exit velocity, as you would have called it in Tasman theory, was pretty good as well. Tony, you point to obviously his record in the championship where he was absolutely phenomenal. DCL, I think you're pointing to the start of last season. This is the thing with DCL, and I find it quite interesting. And then you're also pointing at the fact that Everton's fixtures are pretty much far and away the best of any clubs kind of in the first 6, 8, 10 game weeks.
Mm.
Antonio, it's a little bit more difficult, but I think this is just me revealing my reticence on West Ham again, that with him, I've just been burnt too many times as well with injuries and things.
I'm exactly the same.
That I find it
hamstrings, yeah.
Yes, and like no matter how good his underlying stats often are when he's playing, and just, for example, even in the final, the second half of last season, like he's right up there in terms of XG. He's the third best for forwards for XG behind only Iheanacho and Kane. He's fantastic, and Iheanacho is one we haven't mentioned here. He's kind of getting the raw end of this deal because we've kind of put question marks, I think, back over his game time just because of Daka and because of the Vardy stuff and everything, but also just because Leicester's fixtures are a little bit tough. But the thing with him and Iheanacho, I think, could be a real a decision that the template comes to rue is excluding him.
I think it depends on the Community Shield, doesn't it? Like if he shows up in that game and he does a goal, then suddenly he's in every team.
Yeah, but this is it, Tom. Like he could score a 1-yard tap in that he got through absolutely through no skill of his own. Like it could just be a spill by Ederson. And suddenly we're going to find that Iheanacho is going to be a must-buy player. And at 7.5, like given his exit velocity last season, honestly, if he was priced 8 or 8.5, I wouldn't have been surprised. And so that 7.5 price tag looks very, very tempting. And also, he didn't have Euros, which helps.
No, absolutely. I think that's basically it with Iheanacho. I think it's just one of those things where it's not Football Manager. He's not going to be suddenly dropped. I'm assuming he's going to play that game against Man City. It's just that with Daka, with Barnes, with Vardy, how's it all going to fit together in the sharp end of Leicester? And that's a tough one. Just dive into these players. I mean, Bamford, hero of Talisman Theory. I don't want to bang on about this guy too much. The ex-Irishman, sorry, Anthony, is now 8 million, which
he's no ex-Irishman. He never put on a green jersey.
Not a Grealish kind of style, but
or Rice.
Many people have basically said 8 million is too much. But he was involved in 45% of the 62 goals last season for Leeds. That's just silly, actually. If you kind of think about a team who, to the eye test, were wave after wave of white shirts piling forward. He was sit from Talisman Theory. Okay, I'm banging on again. But I think maybe we hinge again on the hindsight bias because he's 8 million now, but he scored 194 points last season.
Yeah,
there's definitely a case that he could potentially be a bit kind of fixture proof almost. I mean, I think we remember him at the end of last season, coming off after 60 minutes a lot, or before 60 minutes a lot. But actually, he was actually only subbed in game week 34 and 36 before 60. So I think that we kind of all owned him around that sort of time. We all kind of felt that. But could that 194 points be his Yaya year? Could it be kind of his Anis miraculous? But last year he had, the most shots in the box, most shots on target, most big chances, most XG, and he was second to Kane for his actual shots, actual goals scored amongst strikers. And his opening games are United, Everton, Burnley, Liverpool. Maybe there's one to have your eye on. Basically, I think that could be one that's interesting. Calvert-Lewin, though, yeah, I think you're probably right about him being one who slowed down a lot. 13 of his 16 goals was scored by February last year. So 80% of his output was done by February. It was all over them. He was done. It was over. It was all over for him. But there's a really good point actually by Always Cheating's Brandon about Rondon and Newcastle. And how Rafa made him do his job.
First Boyd, now Rondon. I'm really getting throwbacks.
I know. I'm definitely kind of replaying all the classics. But I did a comparison between Rondon when he was at West Brom and Rondon when he was at Newcastle, and his role really changed. Actually, if you look at the stats, so his expected stats actually increased by a third under Rafa. His frequency of shots in the box increased. His goal involvement off the charts, but actually he had far fewer touches of the ball. And his heat map actually showed him being in the box a lot more. And maybe that may happen DCL, where he's not actually dropping back to be involved in everything. He's more kind of, sticks position sort of thing. And actually DCL was a lot more accurate with his shooting than Rondon. So 55% last season shots on target for DCL versus when Rondon was in his prime for Newcastle back in the day. So he could actually be really interesting. And what's really interesting as well is the contextual data, where you kind of read that there's crossing practice going on in Everton training. The likes of Dean, the likes of Andrews Townsend, the likes of Demarai Gray are kind of feeding in chances for these guys. But
I do feel like that's a real, we've picked out an article that suits, not accusing you, but I feel like that's a real article that's been kind of picked out, or a point that's been picked out. It's like there isn't a team in the Premier League that doesn't do crossing training, and it's just kind of like that's been picked out because it kind of just fits the trope with that Newcastle team.
I haven't got Calvert-Lewin at the moment. Who I do have is Watkins, who's in the template. I think that's fixtures. I think so. You'll see in front of you if you're watching or if you're listening. Watford, Newcastle, and Brentford. Sorry, in the first 3 games. So 2 promoted teams in the first 3 fixtures, 2 home games as well in the front 3.
Mm-hmm.
And the key stats with Watkins, we mentioned him actually. I think in the first pod we did back, but I've done a little bit more kind of digging on this. So obviously XG of 16.28, 14 goals, whatever. That's pretty decent for the first season of the Premier League. But he actually hit the woodwork, Anthony, 7 times. That's actually only Harry Kane hit the woodwork more last year. And he also had 2 goals ruled out by VAR. That's joint first amount of goals ruled out by VAR. I mean, you count in 2 of those goals hit the woodwork going in. One of those VAR goals, suddenly he's got 18 or 19 goals. And suddenly he is 8.5 plus. So potentially he could be one who I can completely understand basically why he's in the template.
Yeah, and I think, look, we've talked about the 200 club quite a lot in this episode and in previous episodes. I think with Watkins, I'm not saying that he will be in the 200 club, but one of the kind of like entry criteria usually for being in the 200 club is being capable of getting to double figures for both goals and assists. He is more than capable. In fact, he did it last year in his first season in the Premier League. It's good. This is an important thing. Or sorry, he didn't. He was 1 short in terms of assists. He got 9 assists. He was just on it. And Bamford actually did it.
Yeah, didn't quite.
And I think that pardon?
Didn't quite get there, did he?
Yeah, didn't quite get there, but a hair's breadth. Someone else hit the post probably off some pass he gave. And you're just like, there you go. Like that's how close he got to it. And I think he does have that link up play that kind of provides you with that second outlet for points in a way that like you could also say for Raul Jimenez or indeed Bamford, as I was saying too.
No, absolutely. All right. So Raul Jimenez, yeah. I mean, let's keep an eye on him. Game week 4, when their fixtures turn. But I think there's a couple of other guys to mention here. We mentioned Antonio already. Tony, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier on. Mm-hmm. Even the likes of FPL Salah, my friend Abdul, has broken his rule on Tony just because he kind of noted that there's no one between the 6 to 7 kind of million kind of price points that are interesting given the fixtures for Tony. Obviously, it's Chris Wood at 7 or whatever. And even B&M, Fernando's Miles Nardo, has basically said that Tony, outside of overthinking, is not worth not starting with. Yeah, he was actually involved in 52% of Brentford's goals last season, Tony. I think it's a FOMO pick, but I'm happy to go with it. But there's Callum Wilson, which I think we should probably just meditate on here before we hit towards the end. Just because I know he's your man, and he was also a proper hero of Talisman Theory this year. 12 goals, 6 assists last season, 134 points. Beset by injury problems. I mean, he actually had his lowest kind of game time of the last 3 years. But he was still involved in 37% of Newcastle's goals and a massive 51% of the goals scored when he was actually on the pitch. It was the second time in the last 3 years he's done this, where he's got over 50% of the goals scored from the team he plays for when he's on the pitch. So Bournemouth in 2018-19, he actually was involved in 52% of the goals that they scored. But he's a proper talisman, isn't he? And he also loves playing West Ham, who he plays up first. So I remember Handball Gate a little while ago when he was at Bournemouth. And he scored against each of Newcastle's opponents in the first 4 games recently. A proper set and forget. And there's a really recent interview with The Athletic where he throws some shade towards Steve Bruce, but it made me think that this guy, I really want him. He's not on my team at the moment, as you'll see in a second, or you'll hear in a second. But Anthony, you're a big fan of Wilson, aren't you?
Yeah, he just always finds his way into my FPL team, and he always seems to find a way to provide points for my FPL team. And these are, important features of FPL is having a player who gets points for your team. And I just like it. Yeah. Part of it is the fact that, he does come out so well in talisman theory. Like it's ridiculous how much Newcastle rely on him and previously Bournemouth relied upon him. And he is a very, very good player from that perspective.
Yeah.
Injuries are a problem. And even I actually got a bit unlucky last year with him and just didn't quite work out for me in that sense, but I still got a nice few points off him. But like, if you just sort even last season, which I think we would all agree was an off season for him, not as off as the last season at Bournemouth, but an off season because of his time out or whatever. 12 goals, 6 assists. If you sort per game, he was 4th for strikers for goals. If you sort per game as well for assists, he was 8th for strikers. And in terms of FPL points, the golden thing, because of all those sweet bonus points he was getting, because nobody else in Newcastle does anything, he was 3rd for points per game for forwards. Like,
yeah,
the man's a prodigy. Like it's just incredible. He just prints points when he manages to make it onto the pitch. West Ham first, who I fancy to potentially be serially flaky. Then you've got Aston Villa. And I think he's just the perfect character to be the heartbreaker of the FPL community, or just managers who happen to have Martinez. Southampton, they're beatable. And then there's Man United, and like, he's entirely prone to scoring against Man United. There's no game.
The BS 90th minute penalty.
This is it. Like, but there's this is it. Yeah, don't watch the game. Do not watch the game. Don't even watch the highlights. Just check out the stats at the end and just count your points. And just be delighted with yourself and just be smug. But don't ever watch him. Never watch him, because you'll be totally put off it.
I genuinely do quite want him.
Yeah, it's hilarious. Like, you look at all 38 fixtures, and I'm just like, yeah, I could totally see him scoring.
He said to Alan Shearer, I want 20 goals next season, and that I'm
always afraid of getting too interested in these articles where a player expresses their wish to do something. I sometimes see on Twitter, it's like, player says that, like, I'm targeting 30 goals for the season, and then FPL Twitter is like, oh my god, he's targeting 30 goals, like he's gonna score, and you're like, come on guys, that's not gonna happen. That's not how it works. But with Wilson, it actually might.
It might. I think 20 goals is pretty decent, especially if Fraser picks it up. Right?
20 goals is pretty decent. 15 is good, Callum. It would be more than you ever got before.
12 goals is whatever. 20 would be, as you said, that would be must-own territory. I can see that happening. Final thing to kind of cover off here in the fringes for the striker territory. No one's in template, 6.0 to 4.5, or 5.5 actually to 4.5. Davis, Keenan Davis, Fergie's mate, highest aim, 8%. Any bargains down here? Not really. Not quite yet, at least. So Pookie could get there.
I think there's one bargain in there, Tom.
Okay, fair enough. So Pookie get there. One to watch from game week 4. 11 goals, 3 assists last time he was in the Premier League. And Talisman King, he did dry up January last time he was in the Premier League. Didn't score again in the Premier League after scoring the consolation versus Spurs in game 24 last year. And Josh King, 5.5. Some hefty points totals under his belt. Remains to be seen, which the thousands of forwards, I think there's about 10, are given game time for Norwich. Before I move on, Anthony, what have you found? What gem have you unearthed here?
I've been browsing the talent of Northern England, and I have honed in on Turf Moor.
Homed in
in this case. Homed in on Turf Moor. And what I've realized is that Chris Wood is not there. That's the key detail. He's at the Olympics, or he has been at the Olympics. And so that leaves a Burnley striker at 5.5 who needs to be playing. Who's it going to be? I don't know, but I suspect it's going to be sometimes Austria's finest, Ashley Barnes. Yeah, that's the potential option in there at 5.5. If you're really trying to plug a hole in your team, you'll be there to score the inevitable goal against Brighton in game week 1. But
Yeah,
yeah,
he's an
other than that,
ex-Brighton player as well, isn't he? Ashley Barnes.
he's played everywhere. Maybe he has.
Yeah,
Not sure.
he's ex-Brighton. Yeah, yeah.
But there is a bunch of other players in there, most of whom play for Watford,
Yeah,
and most of whom
J
you don't
Rod,
want.
Vidra, whatever.
Oh yeah, but like, this year anyway, it doesn't seem right now anyway that the bargain basement strikers are
Yeah,
going to be interesting.
it's one to watch, isn't it? More than anything.
Yeah.
All right. So, other thoughts then, basically. What's your overall view of the pricing this season, Anthony?
I think it's a pretty, they've given us some difficult choices, as they should do. I'm not sure if they've given us enough difficult choices when you look at things on a micro level, on a per team basis. Like, for example, the Mane thing really annoys me. The fact that United maybe, they could have classified one of their midfielders as a striker just to cause just a little bit more headaches in the way that they did with Aubameyang.
We have mentioned
brought him back
Cavani
forward.
here. I mean, that he's again one of those players who could kind of
he briefly came up. Yeah, I don't think so. Like, maybe he might. It's just early on. Again, people just aren't sure what to do with him. I think overall it is good. The lack of 4.5 defenders is quite interesting. I think in previous years we've had far more decisions to make in that price bracket.
Maybe that's Lamptey though. I think without Lamptey, it becomes really boring. But
there are plenty
who you could play every game week for the first 8 games.
Yeah, there are plenty. Okay, yeah, fair enough. But there are plenty of other 4.5 options, even Brighton ones, that you could be picking and doing that for, and they're as likely as Lamptey basically to do anything.
Lamptey not as lively as Lamptey, are they?
Almost nobody's as lively as Lamptey. Yes, that's the overall view of the pricing. That I think it's fine. Enough. I don't think it's that difficult though. I do. There are odd gaps where the 4.5 defenders, I would have expected there to be more headaches. There's a whole section of midfielders that I would have expected there to be more headaches that there just isn't right now. And then in the strikers, obviously it is very odd that basically everyone north of 8 million is just out of question right now.
Yeah, I agree. Every year I think throws up its own kind of set of questions. I remember last year as well, we were all contending with City and United missing game week 1. Remember, I was making the case on this kind of equivalent podcast for having Martial on your bench. And every year as well, you have your set of kind of nail players that you don't really think about too much. So this year, for me, it's Salah, Trent, Bruno, Watkins, Dean, Shaw, and Foster. Foster, yeah, 4.0. Wow. But none of them have really left my team. I've not really thought about them. And you'll be building around them in practice. So it means you've got kind of, just over half of your team maybe to tinker with. Well, 88 spots this year, I'm tinkering with. And this year, I think more than ever, it's about getting balance right in terms of price points. And as you mentioned, as we've mentioned, there's lots of attractive defensive options, and big at the back could perhaps be back because you've got Trent, you've got Dean, you've got Shaw, and
I have the Ward at the moment, which is White, Alexander-Arnold, Robertson, Diaz, and then the bit of it is Dina. Yeah,
and I think that there's definitely that. And I think that in the midfield and in the striker spots, you've got kind of a lot of players that FPL have hedged their bets on. Basically, could Watkins take off? Could Jota take off? They're all kind of in the middle kind of area. Kind of a homogenous kind of blur. And a lot of the time, actually, for me, it kind of homes in on whether you kind of take a third Liverpool player, just because the beginning of the season for Liverpool is pretty decent. I think there is definitely a lot of interest in terms of if you are able to look past last season. Liverpool basically have, they do face Chelsea in game week 3, Man City in game week 7. But 6 of their first 8 opening games are not bad at all. And there is, to move on to my team here, a lot of kind of questions surrounding Triple Liverpool or not. Just because I think Robertson knocks out the third striker for me. I mean, I've got a weird magnetic attraction to Wilson. Maybe I've been sort of, incepted by you. But I can't really work out where I go here, really, because I feel like I just have the first striker. But do I trust Jota to make it all kind of fit together? Or do I hedge it completely and go with, TAA Salah or do something else? Or, do I have the courage to go no brew? I'm not really too sure yet.
Yeah,
I
like
do like
for
the
those
squad.
for those on audio, I think the thing that's key to note about your team is that your bench as it stands is Brownhill, Veltman, and Davis. And
Yeah, and the
Brownhill
whole team
basically,
is
yeah,
Sanchez in goal, Trent, Robertson, Shaw, Dean at the back, Salah, Fernandes, Havertz, ESR, and then Tony and Watkins being the striking duo.
it's the Brownhill that is your bench that makes me quite concerned.
But he's going to play. He did actually play the majority of the games last year.
No,
So
no, no,
that's
no,
not
no, no,
the way
no,
around.
no, no, no. I'm using his name as a descriptor. It's just not a particularly good defense or a good bench. Like,
Yeah.
okay, Veltman plays, Brownhill tips along, and then you've got Davis.
Yeah.
It's just
I think two's all
you're a
right.
hit or using 2 free transfers away from fixing something.
Yeah, maybe. I think you're in the kind of the Pritchard sort of ultra cautious sort of area.
I
I'm
don't
not
know.
particularly worried about that,
I
and
Yeah.
doesn't worry me at all. I think that's an okay bench.
Are you going to wildcard early? Do you think?
Um, I'm not too sure about that. I'm not too sure. I think that because you can, what I didn't like about this team, and I'm no way, any way locked, is that I've got to take kind of Smith Rowe out game week 2, game week 3 when they play Chelsea and Man City potentially, and throw in Veltman,
Mhm.
who's on my bench, as you recognised, for the Watford and Everton games. I I think that it's a nice enough kind of starting point, and you can kind of take it from there. I wish there were, you know, a kind of an option where you kind of have 11, 15 players who all had perfect fixtures, or 11 players at least who had perfect fixtures for the first kind of 4 game weeks. We didn't have to do any rotation or whatever. But I think that kind of looks like the way it is for me at the moment. And the big one for me, as I said earlier, is basically having that kind of third Liverpool player, because Robertson basically means that I don't have that third striker. And do I want Wilson in there? Do I want to get rid of Robertson and having 4.5 million with defender? Maybe, maybe. I'm not too sure yet, but I do like this squad. But I'm just not too sure. You can look this up on Twitter. It's the most recent thing I tweeted. But I mean, if you do have a third striker in this, if you keep Robertson, basically you end up with Salah, Bruno in the 6.0, like Harrison or Ben Rama or something, and 4.5 million midfielders, and that does not
Mhm.
fill me with confidence. I mean, I'm glad there's still a little way to go
I
because
would
I'm not
I'd,
particularly
I would
there.
I would I would ask you to show the viewers at home the alternative choice, the hourglass approach, which doesn't quite do what you've said there, but still manages to have 3 strikers. You
Yeah,
knock onto
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, that's something that also has crossed my mind. But I mean, am I going to have 5 at the back? I mean, at the beginning of the season when the games have not been played, you're like, oh, that's really interesting. The reality is when you've actually sat through games where you've got 5 defenders going, yeah, it's tough.
It
Anthony,
is.
so how are you set up? And looking at this, you are in a 5-3-2, so you're in the inverse triangle formation.
Yes, the Christmas tree.
Sanchez, you've gone with Alexander Arnold, Robertson, Ben White, Diaz, and Dean, and in midfield Salah, Bruno Fernandes, and you've also ended up in that pitfall with the 6.0
Yeah,
midfielder,
midfielder.
and
Traore. It's great.
somehow Tony's ended up on your bench.
Well, like that's just week 1. Yeah.
Right.
There's a decision there between, do you play White away to Brentford or Tony at home to
Mhm.
Arsenal?
Okay.
There's a bit of debate there. Like, I can't say that I love this team or anything, but I
It's a
certainly
four
like
three
the
three, isn't
defense.
it? It's a 4-3-3, isn't it? You're going to play Tony over White. That's the foregone conclusion, and have Tony, Wilson, and Watkins, which I think is the 3 up front I want as well.
I again have Brownhill on the bench, and you could, I guess, arguably describe my defense as a Brownhill as well, in that, like, it's got Brownhill and Alan, the previously
Hmm.
mentioned hero of the bargain basement midfielder category, and then of course it has Tony. So it's like, whereas you have, let's say, a playing a playing useful asset in Veltman, I have Tony or White, I guess, for that position.
But I was
and then,
saying, I have ESR who becomes game week 2, becomes that guy, and then Veltman plays. So I end up with, same as you, having a bum heavy kind of thing.
Yeah, and I like it though. That's the thing is that okay. So I've got my obligatory Brighton defense thing going on with Sanchez. I want to double up on Liverpool. I'm not particularly interested in Jota right now, so that's TA and Robertson put in. I can't really get into any of the debates to have one of the cheaper Liverpool defenders instead. White, I'm quite happy with the 4.5 option, and I don't really feel the need to squeeze down to 4.0. Especially like, okay, I bring him down to 4.0 just to make a fodder, for example. Like, it's not like there's some 5.0 midfielder that I really want that I would upgrade to from Brownhill or Alan. There's just no benefit there that really kind of tempts me. Diaz, I want a Man City defender. I don't see, I think there's a real chance to get ahead there that other people just aren't really buying into. So Diaz is in there as the nailed of them. And then Digne is in. He's the most recent inclusion of this defense. It was actually only when I did a bit of a thread the other day that I really kind of homed Tom in on the Digne thing and realized, okay, there's a lot of interest there, you know. That
I can buy that.
Yeah, it just suddenly, look, with those really good Everton fixtures, and as you said, I think about Digne too. It's like, I don't have Calvert-Lewin, I have Digne at least. Okay.
Yeah, I'm saying. I think that's kind of the same sort of the balance I've struck. All right. Well, we've spoken for a while. I don't think there's loads of kind of minutiae that we go into in terms of what we think about X, Y, and Z. But hopefully that was useful. This is one of those podcasts which we both prepare for an awful lot. And it's one of those as well where often you kind of have a majority of your notes in the cutting room floor. And Anthony, most of his notes are probably shredded, and a lot of mine are shredded as well. But hopefully that was really useful in terms of giving an idea of how this year's pricing has fallen out. I really hope that was useful, and we hope that analysis is going to help you in terms of how you will choose your teams going forward.
Yeah, thanks very much for listening, guys. I think that pretty much rounds off this show. If you haven't listened to our summer specials, there were 3 of them posted over the last few weeks. They are all really good. They've all been really well received, and I think you'd really enjoy them if you haven't listened to them already. If you have listened to those, well, you know then that we are Who Got the Assist, and thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We would really appreciate if you could give us a 5-star review on whatever app you listen to this podcast on, because that certainly helps us in feeds. And it's the start of the season. This is when new listeners come on board, and so your 5 stars does an awful lot for our metrics at this point. The league code, if you want to join our FPL league, is 2IP43T. You can do a Partridge-esque tinkle to it and go to IP43T if you want to remember it, and then go and type it. It's really good to be back. Thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks very much. We'll be back next week for the final preview ahead of game week 1. We're joined by a familiar face, and we're going to keep doing some semblance of video stuff. But in the meantime, hope to assist you. Think about the prices ahead of the new season, and we'll speak to you very, very soon. Goodbye.